Wonderful. Thank you so much.
It has been pressed. So
right. Wonderful. Wonderful. So we're live now.
I'm gonna check on the live stream page and see how we're doing.
Right. And so I'm not gonna say too much. I'm just, you know, if people can hear me, that's fast. Oh shit. Oh yeah. As soon as you give me the link, then I can I can, you know, do what we do with that.
I took a copy and I gotta find a window with you. Here we are. And transferring it your way. And there we go.
Okay, there we are. Thank you. There. Okay. So press that. Okay, so I heard a echo there, and all right, let's get that share.
I have to check what's running on my end.
And okay, great. And let me shut that down. Go over to the other side. Okay. Let me see. Here. Oh, Daniel says he hears us. Bless you, Daniel Arola, dear brother in battle. Okay, glad to know that. Always important. And big shout out to he. And okay, let me try and get this. Everybody can hear me breathe.
It's amazing what this what it picks up, the microphone. Sometimes I heard a few times like a motorcycle or a car go somewhere in behind there.
Oh yeah. Yeah, you mean from my end? From my end, yes.
Yeah, from your end.
Yeah, it's incredible. Yeah. Well, you may be able to hear jackhammers, those lunatics work into the dark over here, and you know, I could go on for hours about that. Right. What are you mumbling?
I was gonna mention something I read today, but then I changed my mind.
You're mumbling.
I thought.
Oh, okay.
Not sure if I want to launch.
Well, you're welcome to change your mind again and mention it if you.
Yeah. All right.
Okay.
Maybe.
Well, why don't you go ahead? I mean, we got some time. It'll carry us to the top. Come on.
All right. Well, there was some study that came out with like how they put out with like housing ratio, how good the housing is inside a city, you know. So they like do the research along those lines, and they put this out. I don't know how many, maybe every 2 years or so. But anyway, it's and what they found is that Toronto actually moved into number 10 spot as far as how expensive rent is, and you know what person's chances of getting housing is. And it moved. Wow. It's tied with London in this study. Hold on, I haven't opened all my browsers yet because I just got back on, so I don't have it right in front. But I had it. I probably could bring it up. But essentially, Toronto went from like being 28th to 21st place, and now into number 10. And it's really like it's insane how much people are paying for like one bedroom and stuff like that in this city. And it's increased like quite rapidly, but the only like other cities that were ahead in the study were obviously San Francisco was in number 8, and then LA was like there, and I didn't know these other cities like Sydney in Australia, Sydney and Melbourne were in the top 10. And I forgot what the other cities were now, but I think Beijing or something was number 1 as far as expensive rents. But yeah, but Toronto's really moved up, and you can kind of. It's getting really weird with the housing here. A lot of people get left out. And anyway, so I read that, but
wow,
there was another related story that like I read as a like I read that after, but the first one that like I read in the morning was this man. He got into an apartment building like kind of not really that far from I know where the intersection is actually, and so it's these tall, you know, fairly tall towers of apartment buildings. But he was disabled. He was in a wheelchair, and he got there based on, I don't know, some sister-in-laws signing on the lease, and he was going to take it over. But the landlord made his life hell because she didn't want him in the building. And today, they finally, the tribunal, like the council that they have at the took him through, and they won the case. So now the landlord owes him like $60,000. Though, like he says that usually it's really tough to get these people to pay up. But yeah, two years of harassment, and eventually he was barred for trespassing and stuff like that. Especially like he goes like, how come I need housing, man? I can't be out on the street because he can't even get around properly. But anyhow, yeah. So that was kind of like two things that caught my eye that sort of went together. Anyhow, yeah. Well, okay, that didn't take that long.
Well, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, there. See, you see, yeah. So at any rate, thank you for sharing that, and it's just exemplary of how fucked it is to live in North America, and well, fuck anywhere that's developed now. I mean, basically, and you know, when you're homeless in a wheelchair, that really sucks. Okay. Yeah. Okay.
There has been a lot of development around the whole case and Huawei. A lot's been going on. Even
tell us what you know.
So yeah, so even in the last few days, this just keeps developing, and since we kind of since we opened it up first, it's gone where China's reacted, and we mentioned that they detained a couple of Canadian citizens, arrested. There may be a total of like 12 sort of extra, apprehensions, but it's really gone into like in the last 2 days with the economic news for China. Mr. Xi, the president, I guess or prime minister, Mr. Xi, he he's it's not looking good economically for China right now. They're not getting good numbers, but he is getting involved in this case, and they turned it very political. And in Canada, I'm seeing articles in Canada where they're people are advising that they just like Canada's trying to figure out how to react to what China's doing with detaining all these citizens, and they sentenced this one bloke. I don't know. He was or he's accused of illegally transferring. I think it was something like ecstasy, like methamphetamine. And in China, that's a pretty punishable, very punishable, like in the sense that, or punishable. In the sense that it's illegal, and I guess you can apply the death penalty. But anyway, he was trying to say that it wasn't him, that he was framed. That's what he was going into court, and they changed in his ruling, and they sentenced him to death. And so that's been getting a lot of news attention. And people are like wondering, is this related? But even as this began to sort of take shape in early December. I saw some of the people that were commenting here on local news. This lady from on Chinese Affairs, she goes, I wouldn't advise right now my friends from Canada not to travel to China. She ended her interview on this city TV here that way. And so anyhow, what now they're saying is, what I'm reading is that they're advising that Canada perhaps consider. Now I don't know if this is just kind of like. Scare them or if it's actually real, but to ban Huawei out of Canada just for what China is doing as like leverage to start getting some leverage on them, because they're really diplomatically they're quite powerful, right? It's really difficult to and they're saying they're doing this, the way they're going about it though, it's despicable, is they're starting to take these citizens and they're trying to say through their apparatus here in say Canada, like the Chinese diplomatic consulates and that, they're sort of saying like, well, I guess since it's touched the very top where Mr. Xi Jinping is involved in this, apparently he's taken a concern in this, that they're saying that the arrests, they're there to show that what they're doing is similar to what Canada is doing. You know, it's like to teach Canada, I don't know, like a lesson to show how it feels to be done and all this, and they're sort of taken that way, but I don't see it that way. I think it's just making things worse. It's just showing that it almost ends up showing like they are kind of like guilty of the company, though I think it's really that like they say her father, that she's the daughter of the father who is the head of or founder of the company. So I mean, obviously this stuff does matter. It's not like you can't overlook it, and I think but again, she had a lawyer actually come out today. I forgot, he was a minister, not a lawyer, but a minister of justice of some type. I think he's the current justice minister actually in Canada, and and there was a rebuttal by the former one, which thought it was not good what he said, but he was defending her, and he was saying that she should that Canada should actually not allow her to be extradited, and since Canada doesn't have sanctions against Iran, that they should not apply this whatever U.S. is trying to extradite her on to her right now, and should just release her. Right? So I mean, it's kind of going it's getting deep, and what it is, it's opening up the various levels of government where Justin Trudeau and the Prime Minister and Foreign Affairs Minister Chrystia Freeland, they're saying this is a matter of law and we're trying to stay free, but I don't think they can, because China keeps like going at Prime Minister Trudeau, and like when you were taking this apart, you go, well, what's Prime Minister Trudeau saying on this, right? Because like it is, in the end, it is actually quite political.
Yeah.
On the Chinese half, it is political. So I mean,
it's well,
there could be a lot that could be mentioned, but I'll just kind of, I guess, leave it at that for now.
Oh, you can go on. We've got 2 more minutes. It's definitely something that we all look forward to hearing. Your opinion and or your analysis.
Well, I guess to add, if I add one thing is, or not one thing, but I think China's on the trying to really now is at a point where they got to protect Huawei's reputation, right? Which they have kind of, I think, taken quite a lot of time to build, as far as I see it. It would be pretty tragic. On the other hand, like there are people in Canada that have worked on the educational front, and a lot of companies are standing up for, I don't know about a lot, but I saw one, I forgot their name now, but a pretty big company here in Canada that say they will stand up and keep using Huawei equipment and everything from them. So like Huawei does have a lot of support here, besides the competition. I suppose I don't know how to really measure it. I know Samsung is pretty big here, as usual as they should be. But with Huawei, why they're trying to protect the reputation, or I think is that they now are at that point, is that there was another arrest in and this is Poland now. Well, what they did, apparently, I sent you the article too, so just so people know, is
good.
But it just essentially they apparently the Chinese firms, I read this as well, is they do tend to spy on like technical development and software development companies, sort of in between, that develop hardware and software as well, and so that happens in Canada, and anyway, so in Poland they essentially arrested this. He was a Huawei, I forgot, I think he first worked for the government, Chinese government, as like a diplomat, and then switched over and worked for possibly a Polish software company or some other way, and there was a Polish citizen involved in the arrest and this other person. I don't have their names or anything in front of me, I'd have to dig it up. But this is kind of, it made the headlines. So it, it was another sort of thing that China now with the Huawei, Europe has gone behind. Now, I forgot to mention the main things. Is Europe's response has been to back Canada. The European Union has backed Canada, and I don't know if this was from Germany, but likely Angela Merkel has said that European Union must reconsider doing business with China after China's response to this arrest. So they've been rather that's and again that's a shot right at the reputation which China has been trying to build up. I think for the last since their boons began. Really, this has been a big part of the Chinese presidency. Sort of motion forward has been to build up the companies and the technology. So yeah, that's been there, and now even America, I mean, that's been in the talks that because of the whole of the tariffs and so on. I mean, America does have to negotiate about these tariffs and figure out what they're going to do with China, man. And like, he's sitting back there. This doofus is sitting back there, freaking shutting down the government, man. Anyway, so that takes up the top of the hour. But yeah, he's that too is part of the negotiations. Is the Huawei and the arrest of Wen Zhao. It's getting included into the top talks of any negotiations that are being done out to China. Okay, I'll start the program. I mean, I think we're doing good. I haven't been checking since I've been talking. But yeah, there's people connected, and we seem to be going live, 16 minutes transmitting. So I'll transfer it over to you, and
wonderful.
And probably take my mic off to give full volume and full sound. So there you go, Douglas. It's all yours.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes. Yes, bless you, and very much appreciate that. And I think that I have to express, of course, all of my gratitude to everyone who has gathered so far, and everyone who, of course, lets us know that they can hear us. So what I'm going to do is just kind of take a quick look here at the Facebook timeline, which is the closest thing that we have, of course, to a chat room, and that is managed by our chat room monitor, and that is, of course, Ramona Halitha Henry, and she does a wonderful job. I want to thank all of the ladies. So far, it's only ladies aside from our dear brother in battle, Daniel Arola, always with us, and the primary lady who responded first was our wonderful grandma dame, Ramona Halitha Henry. For those of you who cannot find her last golden star post in which she adds her thread of links, that is on my personal friends page. You have to scroll down and you will find it if you find a post by Ramona Halitha Henry. That is, let me scroll down here and I'll tell you what it is, because it is important that people see it. And so it's right down into, consider this the ads for the beginning of our transmission, by the way. This is kind of like the ad part where we're just bringing up all kinds of things like before we start a conventional transmission if this were a terrestrial broadcast. So we have to cover things for our sponsors, and Ramona Halitha Henry falls into that. And I've just skipped past her gold star that was the latest one, and found her January 16th one, because her original gold star or her latest gold star from our latest transmission is terribly hidden, and it's hidden beneath a post of her own under which all of her other posts have collapsed. And so I just have to find that, and if I don't find that, then it's a tragedy for the evening. But it is on the Facebook timeline. And the problem is you might have to look under Gregory Strasbau's post or a post by Daniel Arola. And this is something which I've told her to do, is to tag her gold stars. She doesn't seem to have done that. She doesn't seem to have done that with this latest gold star either. So what she has to do is find the other one with the method that I taught her, and on her own time, and tag it. That'll bring it to the top of the page. She has to do that with both of those for other people to find it. Otherwise, we will link it with the references link that I provide in the banner that will provide the link after transmission for our latest transmission before this one, in which we went back to Epiphany because, of course, Epiphany was part of this latest 3-day weekend, coincidentally or synchronistically falling on the Right Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day weekend. And that was a confluence of events due to the Julian calendrical system honoring Epiphany, quite some time, up to 2 weeks after the conventional Epiphany of the Gregorian calendar. It is important to remember that the proper calendar, or the original conventional calendar, is actually the ancient Julian calendrical system named after Julius Caesar, which is still used by the Byzantine Orthodox Church, which covers, of course, all of the churches of the Eastern Rite, the Slavonic liturgy, and these would be the Oriental churches of the Near East, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, etc., from which the Russian Orthodox Church has been excommunicated by the closest thing we have to a pope, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, because of its aggressions and its desire to pervert and mutate the religion. Now, this is something that should happen to the evangelicals in the United States from general Christendom, but of course Protestantism has no equivalent to a papacy or a patriarchy in the far west, across the Atlantic, and on either side of the Atlantic, as a matter of fact. You would think perhaps whatever they call the head of the Church of England, I believe that would be a bishop. I might be wrong on that because I don't know much about the Anglican Church per se, but I do know that the Church of England has never claimed a formal kind of universal authority over the other Protestant schisms, which have proliferated since the days of the original Protestant Reformation. So I've got that link from Lena Shea, lovely lady from January 20th. God bless her. Delightful. Delightful. It is so wonderful, and she will, of course, be adding that to her top site, which she helps my Maquis benefactress write, and they together write the top site, which is an acronym for topics covered in this episode. And as soon as she's done with that and emails that to myself, my Maquis benefactress, then I will, of course, have that up as a banner for everyone else to access. And so there we have that. So that's the casual things that we've gotten out of the way. Now for something more personal and intimate, a solar return shout out to the lovely lady Shola Blazing, who is not hearing this because she is being taken out to have dinner with her husband. And so since she's out dining, she will catch this later on the recording. But a hug and a kiss to the lovely Shola Blazing. And I want to remind the lovely lady Fabia Floriani, she's always in my thoughts, hearts, and prayers. I did not talk to her during her birthday weekend because I figured that might be busy. We'll try and get myself together to give her a call sometime soon. But a wonderful lady as always, the angel over my shoulder, Fabia Floriani. And Shola Blazing's been with us from the beginning as well. Two lovely birthday ladies, Shola Blazing's birthday being as of now, and Fabia Floriani's solar return being quite recent. The day of my latest transmission, as a matter of fact, the 20th. And we want to give a shout out to Ronald Stroney as well, our magnificent magnificent brother in battle who's a member of the Deep Space Pilots acid rock band that's been around forever. Do look up the Deep Space Pilots. Do put a like on their YouTube channel videos. Do follow Deep Space Pilots on their Facebook fan page. And they are, of course, wonderful people. Ronald Stroni, main man behind them. And he ordered all of the MP3 audio from Mike Ringley of Revolution Radio of my transmissions from that particular Nightmare platform. And surprisingly enough, Mike Ringley actually honored his word, and for money, for monetary compensation supplied by Ronald Stroni, he actually delivered. So if you pay enough money, then you get enough of a response. And so that was done with that particular situation, and put that at some ease. I want to, of course, as well as thanking our lovely chat room monitor, the Grand Manageress of our Facebook timeline, Ramona Halitha Henry, with our usual hugs and kisses. I want to give a shout out to all of the ladies who have given us feedback on our quality of sound and their ability to hear us. That would, of course, be the wonderful Sarah Shields, the adorable fangirl Lainey Shea, the lovely lady Dianero Richon in Cincinnati, and of course anyone else who joins us. Do make yourselves known, and if I do see you active, I will give you an acknowledgement. And I want to give an acknowledgement to a wonderful adult entertainer and uninhibited actress that I can never thank enough, who's always with us in company, the lovely Moriah Mills. So shout out there, dear lady, and best to thyself for spreading the word, sharing our logos, to use the biblical term, among others. And Devon E. Bulldog, wonderful Native American. I believe he's a first respondent, possibly firefighter, or maybe he works with Avalanche Roofing and Exteriors. But I for some reason, I have this image of him as having a first responders training or one of those paramilitary backgrounds, because in the end, all of the uniformed services, the blue-collar mafias, which dominate our shall we say, our economy in so many ways in the cities, in the urban metropolises, which are, of course, the center of civilization of all humanity, are these paramilitary groups in uniform known as firefighters, emergency medical technicians, and, of course, policemen. And if he's not one, he certainly has the look. Devon E. Bulldog, as a native Canadian, is, and by that I mean actual Canadian Indian, is intimidating enough in appearance, where I'm sure most criminals that he would run into would surrender themselves were he in law enforcement. And other than that, we return now to 12 minutes after top of the hour. The transmission in and of itself. So here's where we get started in earnest. Around the world, to start off with, just to catch us back onto current events, Prime Minister of the Japanese Empire, Shinzo Abe, has met within the last 24 hours with Vladimir Putin. Talks may still or talks may have ceased for the moment. The Japanese president arrived in Russia yesterday for talks today, or it might have been that he arrived the day before yesterday for talks yesterday, because, of course, we have to remember that both of those nations, the Empire of Russia and the Empire of Japan, are a day ahead of us here on this side of the international date line, always 24 hours ahead of us. So what we consider yesterday is the day before yesterday for everyone that's west of the ID line, the international date line. We are in the West, east of the international date line, and we're always 24 hours behind, and about a century behind in terms of technology from Far East Asia, and about a century ahead of technology from the Orthodox East of Mother Russia. Now, in terms of by the way, just to give you some in-depth perspective there, when I was doing uniformed security at the absolute bottom end of the security enforcement spectrum, even though it was an armed post. I was doing the cream puff end of security work in the San Francisco, south of the Market region. And there was a enormous conference and convention center assembly place that was a former aircraft hangar in downtown San Francisco, south of Market, is in the industrial area of San Francisco, which of course is an industrial wastegate that is converted into warehousing and garbage recycling plants and the like, because we're not producing anything in San Francisco on any mass industrial level per se. So during this time in the early 90s, on one of the easier contracts, there was a period of time that I just one contract that I had among a number with a horrible organization owned by 3 retired or semi-retired San Francisco Police Department officers. That was called Executive Security and Investigations, which I'm happy to say no longer exists. Obviously, its own lack of professionalism and its paralegal, shall we say, illegal operations, ultimately leading to its being shut down. They had me in a warehouse where they had this kind of like technology display of the latest products from communist China. And at that time, we're talking about this was before the Clinton administration, and the Japanese had not yet been driven out of understandable resentment away from investiture in the American economy, which they were upholding. The American economy has always been upheld by Japan. When Japan divested in America, the American economy died. And that happened under William Jefferson Clinton. And the reason that the Clintonista regime drove the Japanese away was because their economic advisor at the time, a solid Democrat who financially backed and financed Hillary Rodham Clinton, was a certain subhuman piece of shit named Donald Trump. And Donald Trump acted as their unofficial economic advisor and said, oh, you got to push the Japs out. America can't compete. The Japs won't provide us a level playing field. And so caught up in this Trump, shall we say, dysfunction, this absolute severance from reality, then William Jefferson Clinton went to the point of removing all Christmas lights from the White House Christmas tree, because everything at that time was manufactured in Japan, including all Christmas lights. And so at that time, they had to actually revert to candles. That year, when Clinton assaulted Japan by a trade war, for lack of a better word, not officially declared, but what he did was he removed and, shall we say, entirely revised the incredibly favorable trade agreements that Japan had won for itself via the Second World War, by which it had come to the point where it destroyed all American industry. And at this point, by the 90s, was throughout the 80s and into the 90s, was basically upholding the American economy with its investments, which American protectionists or reactionaries like Donald Trump said the Japanese were taking advantage of this to buy real estate in America, to buy America up in terms of its actual land and territory, which they now accuse the communist Chinese of doing under Donald Trump, and which is why he has declared out-and-out trade war with communist China. Well, at that time, none of this had come to pass. The Japanese had not been forced to take their money out of the United States to divest it and reinvest it in communist China, creating the made in China boom that we know of today. So communist China was essentially still a third world nation. And at that time, the elder senior security enforcement officer, a former, I can't remember whether he was Army or Marine. It didn't matter. His name was Sergeant Hackworth. And Sergeant Hackworth was a white trash piece of shit. He was just this idiot who was prone to sleeping on duty, and he would remove his firearm so he could sleep more comfortably because, of course, the firearm would just jab into his ribs while he was sleeping, poor son of a bitch. So he would remove his firearm and then just leave it next to him on the couch, where, of course, any motherfucker could come by and pick up his firearm and blow him away. But that would simply be putting an animal out of its misery before they turned on, using it against anyone else. But this is the kind of idiot I had to deal with. But he had a cogent observation to make, aside from his faults. I guess when you're lying around all day doing nothing, you have opportunity to open up an eye once in a while and just, take the world in. One of the things he had brought up was the former industrial show place for the Soviet Union. And the Russians were still Soviet at the time, or barely beginning to change. They collapsed, of course, under Reagan. So it must have been right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russians started having like trade shows. And so he said, oh, yeah, the Russians, of course, he still referred to them as Soviets because that was his lifetime indoctrination, having been in the service, of course, and fighting against them as an actual combat veteran from the Vietnam War era. He was actually involved with the dogs, the canine units. He was actually involved with the canine units. So that was like probably the closest thing he ever got to. Oh, wait, he was married, so I can't say that's the closest thing he ever got to sex with a bitch. So putting that aside, he emitted strange odors all of his life, and I think it was due to his collecting an enormous amount of animals. He was an animal hoarder, so he had like Noah's Ark in his home. I remember that. He had all the photos of all these different types of animals and different species he had, and the stench around him was just so great. It was obvious that cleaning up the waste products was never foremost on his priority list. But anyhow, to the Russians, his observation about them was that when they held the trade shows, he couldn't believe what they had to display, which was absolutely motherfucking nothing. That it was just the trade shows had nothing of industrial potential to show. It was like they were like generations behind, ages behind, centuries behind anything available in the United States. They could not believe it. They literally gasped in disbelief as if they were seeing magic when they saw something like a fax machine or a photocopy machine. Of course, we look at a fax machine today as just absolutely nothing. It's a dead-end technology. Nobody uses a fax machine other than people in the federal government. And nobody's using that now since the federal government shut down. But so he was making a joke about what we would see with the Chinese communist trade show. And he said, they'll probably be showing us hammers and anvils. That was pretty much it. What I saw was a lot of porcelain kitsch, just tchotchkes, little porcelain Buddhas, little porcelain models of Mao, just little porcelain, figurines. This is what they had. So there was absolutely nothing of industrial grade output at that time. With Clinton's snubbing of Japan. That's what it was essentially an economic snubbing, not a trade war, but a snubbing. And the Japanese divestiture in the United States, and then their revestiture in communist China, then the made in China boom overtook the world as produced, manufactured in Japan. So just putting that into some perspective, when we think about the Japanese president arriving in Russia, this is the equivalent of a colonial minister from Great Britain during the high watermark of the British Empire, at high tide of Victorianism, visiting some God-benighted or God-forsaken place in the middle of some juxtaposition between Africa and Asia. And so that's what the Japanese president arriving in Russia is like. That's how to take it. And he's dealing with white savages for talk of 4 disputed islands off the northern coast of Hokkaido, known as the Southern Kurils in Russia or the Northern Territories in Japan. The islands were claimed by the Soviet Union in the final days of World War II, as understood by the majority of you out there who have no understanding of World War II. Let's just say it was in the closing days of proactive prosecution of proactive hostilities as declared. Prior declaration of cessation of continuity or proactive prosecution of hostilities, because ceasefire wouldn't be declared until December 31st in 1946. So then you have this situation where, of course, this dispute has prevented both the Russian Empire and the Empire of Dainippon, or Greater Japan, from signing a post-war peace treaty ever. So they are still in a legal state of war. So the Japanese president is visiting the enemy. He is behind enemy lines. He may have returned home at this point, for all I know. Both nations, both empires being a day ahead of us. So that's the first thing to update yourselves about the other side of the world. The other is that Germany and France have sealed a deal. As Brexit continues to implode, France and Germany are formalizing their place at the center of the European Union, with a new treaty that promises common positions and joint statements on major issues facing the European Union and the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Now, this might be the beginnings of their answer towards European disunion. Now, we're getting some input from our brother in battle, Daniel Arola, just taking a short look at that, and I thank him for his input. And going back to where we are at the moment, of course, off of the live link, where I've seen his input. When it comes to European disunion, everybody in America has the same attitude towards the EU that they do towards Taiwan, which is one of total ignorance and expectations, which, based on a entirely false and anti-historical narrative, or an ahistorical narrative. You could say that they lack history, but the anti-historical narrative is more apropos because they are actually antithetical to history in all of their views. They actually are antithetical to reality because of their entire ignorance of what goes on in the formation, or what happened in the formation of the Nationalist Republic of China, its relocation to the 100 islands of Formosa, what's known today as Taiwan. The Americans are always saying Taiwan's going to fall to communist Chinese aggression. And of course, they've been saying this for over half a century now, and nothing has ever happened. So the Americans have the same attitude towards the European Union and what they feel to be its inevitable disintegration. And that may yet happen, unlike the communist Chinese invasion of Taiwan. That may yet happen in the European Union for reasons that the Americans are really not understanding either. If that does happen, it will be because you will have the reestablishment of core empires or central regional powers that simply come to dominate in totality their regional spheres of influence. That would, of course, be France and Germany, and being the primary movers and shakers in that. Right now, they're united in their purpose, which is to continue the European project, and but in antithesis to the reality of that, as so symbolized forcefully by France and Germany formalizing their place at the center of European Union with this new treaty that promises common positions and joint statements on major issues. What the Americans concentrate on is, of course, whatever motherfucking Russia feeds them off the internet. And so what motherfucking Russia tells you is that the European Union cannot survive in its current form. They will ignore the fact that the European Union has, of course, a central purpose. And the only thing that I will say that would make it possible for European collapse in terms of the Union as we see it currently manifest is the fact that purposes will change. The European Union obviously has a purpose. The purpose that it serves, of course, is far more the hegemony of France and Germany, as it should. And what would undermine the European Union is, of course, being exploited by motherfucking Russia and now their puppet, the United States, in making or redefining the European Union so that it means different things to different members. So for France and Germany, it means global relevance. For other members, a middle tier, it means much needed capital. Now, currently, there's conflicts between Brussels and the United Kingdom, Poland and Hungary, or Polska and Magyarország, and many more. So in the long run, the European Union, as administered from Brussels, will see more and more infighting. And this is because the rest of the former Soviet Eastern European satellites that were once behind the Iron Curtain are nothing, and I mean nothing, more than motherfucking parasites. White trash, sewers of shit. And all they do is suck off Germany's tit and bitch and moan and complain about immigrants. And the stupidest thing about it is that, believe me, take up the Dietrich challenge, go to Poland like Max Spears did. No, don't go like Max Spears did. In fact, do yourself a favor and don't go there at all. But if you want to take up the Dietrich challenge, do what Max Spears did. And of course, that killed him. He died in Poland because what you have is a bunch of white trash drug users who just suck. And they fuck like they fucked Max Spears over and killed him and recorded it while they were snuffing him. Okay, that's Poland. And see if you can see a colored face. See if you can see Asians or blacks. And tell me, you know, about all the minorities, the rainbow color of diversity you see in these places. Of course, if you're a white trash piece of shit, this will be an advantage. And you'll say, oh, this is so refreshing. Well, actually, you won't, because you'll say, I can't find a toilet that works. And I have to stare at my turds for the 3 days that I'm in this Polish hotel. Man, this really fucking sucks. Actually, I can't stare at my turds because it's dark. That's why I couldn't find my way to the toilet in the dark, and why I just took a shit on the floor, ultimately, or out the window. I mean, that's what it would be like in Poland. Why would anyone want to go to fucking Poland? Why would anyone want to go to any of these fucking Eastern European nations is beyond me. And yet these stupid white trash pieces of shit are worried about immigrants. There's no blacks want to go there. There's no Asians want to go there. There's nobody wants to go there in their right fucking mind. So, you know, their xenophobia is their ultimate pathology. Oh, we want to stay pure. We want to stay, it's like entering a trailer park and you're surrounded by all these whites and they say, hey, what are you doing here? We don't want your kind around here. And of course, somebody like me would just say, hey, I'm lost. I really don't want to be here. I would really give anything to get out of here, to teleport, to really be gone from here because, I really can't stand it here. Because if you're, you don't have flush toilets, you're shitting in like chemical decompressant units, then you have to siphon them out to a waste processing area. It's like trailer park life. It's just not for me. I just, you're stuffing like, oh shit, what was the trick that was taught to me? The Febreze or whatever they stick in fabric softener. Yes, they stuff that in the walls of the trailers so that the mildew and the mold won't just overwhelm you with its stench. So there's this, the lifestyle of stuffing fabric softener behind the faux wooden trailer walls. It's just not for me. And so that's the same thing with any life in Eastern Europe in general, as it is today, as ravished by the communists and left as a wasteland. And so anyhow, so there you go. Thoughts on European disunion will be all these motherfuckers breaking it apart ultimately with their xenophobia, which is going to be a theme we're constantly returning to tonight, this transmission. And of course, Germany finally setting them in light. The Germans will just have to get their act together and conduct a series of invasions. At which point, just do what the motherfucking Russians did in reverse and start re-civilizing these white savages to the east. In the meantime, the United States-China trade fight enters a new round. The next 2 months will prove pivotal in the United States-China trade war. The United States wants a deal by March 1st, or else its last round of tariffs, 10% fees on some 200 billion United States dollars in Chinese imports, will jump to 25%. And the question needs to be asked, will China be able to make major progress on everything Washington wants? And more importantly, will the changes even stick? We see a growing sense of urgency in Beijing and Washington to exact concessions from the other, and soon. But no matter what both want or need in the short term, no deal can paper over all the differences. A deal may well be nigh, but the trade war be just beginning. So that is something to very much take into account. Our world, as you knew it, is over. So I definitely want to let you know we're going to be going into this more and more. And of course, what may ultimately happen might be military conflict. In the meantime, it's a conflict that'll be taking place in a world that is changing so dramatically that one thing that might stop this conflict will be the enormous amount of natural disasters that we are going to see happening in our world. This is not going to dominate my transmission tonight, but it'll dominate kind of an introduction into what some of my detractors and skeptics, who I may, if we have time and energy, if my man, my executive producer, is willing to go with me till 3 a.m. his morning, 2 a.m., 3 a.m., like he does sometimes, I might be going till midnight my time. And that will mean that we're going to get some hours in tonight to cover everything that needs to be covered. We'll see if I've got the energy and duration for that, or the piss and vinegar in me to take it all that way. But a lot of that will be in terms of the gang stalkers later on. They're not going to be devoted to in this transmission. I'm not going to devote much energy to them. But in terms of people who have approached me, based on the fact that my primary gang stalker till this point might be being replaced by a new one because of his spectacular failure, to the point where he's had to withdraw his videos, a number of them, primarily the one that he co-produced with Amber Rose Dio. Richard K. Cole released a video called Douglas Dietrich, Son of Adolf Hitler. Now, because he was going to be arrested by the FBI, even amid this shutdown, which is remarkable, which shows you how just brazen his case was and how long they've been working on it, for the forgery of documents that he committed himself to along with John Victor Lillier. His forgery was going to bring John Victor Lillier serious jail time, which is ultimately why John Victor Lillier killed himself in a suicide attack against myself, which I've gone into in the past. We don't need to cover it this transmission, because he lost all his benefits because, of course, he, like Richard K. Cole, is falsely getting military veterans benefits for combat they never saw. In either case, neither one of them is a combat veteran, was a combat veteran, ever saw a day of combat, and yet get full benefits from you every day of their lives on taxpayer dollar, which is why veterans benefits have got to stop. I'm not on veterans benefits. I don't need to be, because I get benefits through the civilian circuit by having passed genuine tests and multiple exams to filter myself as genuine in the receipt of these benefits. Veterans don't. Stop them from getting any. Let them go the civilian route, as I did, and earn whatever benefits they get. If they got something real, they'll get it. If they got nothing real, deprive them of the VA, which is depriving us of billions of dollars to serve these parasites who have done nothing but commit crimes, rape, murder, child pedophilia, overwhelmingly in terms of their demographics once they're out of the military. So, aside from that, they forge documents so they can accuse each other of not having served, which, of course, the motherfucker Richard K. Cole was doing in my case. Now the FBI's breathing down his ass and he's facing jail time and heavy-duty fines, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth. And now the motherfucker's on the run and had to take down his video, crying all the way. And Amber Rose Dio had to shut her YouTube channel down and leave up a fucking stub because she had to get rid of all the pro-pedophilia porn that was reported. Oh my God, poor bitch. You know, this is why she was tacked onto myself for years to discredit myself by Michael Aquino. And fortunately for me, everybody going to her channel was just going there for my videos, took no notice of all the child porn she had on the side, all the pro Peter Levinda shit, all of the Rich K. Cole shit. And then when they finally came out of the closet together as a asexual couple, then they paid the price. Well, that's karma. Good riddance, motherfuckers. So, one of the things these people have attacked, people like that, has been my exposure of the archaeological reality of the Amazon rainforest as a human artifact, a man-made phenomenon, not a product of nature, but of human macro gardening, meta gardening, gardening on a massive level, which for the Native Americans was their pinnacle of technology. Now, because of the massive denials concerning the ability of humans to even change nature on that continental scale, which of course I've proven again and again by my historical expositions, citing multiple sources of professional anthropologists, professional archaeologists, throughout transmissions in the past, I need to remind people of how our climate's being changed by people right now on a global level based by what Indians are doing on a continent. Not American Indians, but Asian Indians. So, starting off again with the Amazon as an artifact, that's in the American hemisphere. And here in North America, as vicious cold and snow has enveloped the eastern United States, being itself a reminder that individual record cold days during any given year don't erase decades of rising averages. The average time, for instance, between the last frost of spring and the first frost of fall has increased in every region of the United States since the early 20th century. And this phenomenon of extreme weather coming in extreme demarcations, cut and dried like night and day, is a reminder also that both planetary warming and local emissions dramatically alter a region's weather patterns and an entire region's identity and way of life. Now, one of the reference videos that I published a link to via YouTube onto my Facebook timelines was produced by all organizations. Goldman Sachs. Now, Goldman Sachs, of course, are a criminal network of white-collar criminals. They're financial rapists, but they're financial rapists that have been around forever. If anything positive can be said about them, they're the financial rapists we all know and love to hate. Be that as it may, they know money. And they're called on to invest in developing nations like India. And they outline wonderfully the effect of monsoons on what has traditionally been known by men like my father, the Alden maritime sailors, as monsoon Asia. So when they point out the fact that you've got this very short, intense season of rain that feeds 1 billion people, you've got a situation that's ripe for disaster when people start fucking with the system. And they're doing it now via pollution in India that is reshaping the monsoons. Local emissions over the subcontinent of South Asia, what you call India, they're making summer storms more erratic, and they're going to have global consequences. Over the next decade, probably well over 400 large dams will be built on the Himalayan rivers, not just by communist China, but by India itself and shitty little chicken shit gook trash pieces of sewage nations like Nepal, which is now run by a Maoist government since the horrible MK Ultra programmed tragedy of its royal prince massacring the entire royal family, deprived itself of its classical ancient monarchist dynasty. Nepal is now a Maoist cesspit. Overrun. So much for the fucking Gurkhas. Who, my dad always said that. Where are the Gurkhas? Where are the goddamn Gurkhas? Of course, for those of you who are not military aficionados, a Gurkha is a Nepalese tribesman renowned for their violence. They use a blade known as the kukri, a very, how would I say it, distinctively shaped affair. And this kukri is used for slitting people's throats mostly. But the Nepalese Gurkhas are an elite that has been employed by the British Empire worldwide to unleash terror on their enemies for well over a century at this point. And now, of course, the Gurkhas are still contractually obligated to empire and still work in coordination with British forces, obviously have proved totally impotent in stopping a communist takeover of their own nation, preventing their own dynasty from self-immolating. It's a situation that is tragic and a travesty. And as part of this communist fetish for industrialization and modernization, they're going to, along with Bhutan and Pakistan, emulate communist China to the northeast and India to the southwest, and start building as many dams as they can to fuck up the river tributaries of the Himalayas. And so we've got 500,000 large dams, or nigh 500,000, that are coming online within 10 years, within this decade, to feed the region's hunger for electricity and its need for irrigation. And with that comes new ports and thermal power plants that are going to line the coastal arc that runs from India through Southeast Asia to China. India and China have embarked on schemes to divert rivers to bring water to their driest lands, costing tens or, realistically, hundreds of billions of dollars. They be the largest and most expensive construction projects the world has ever seen. At stake in how these plans unfold is the welfare of the majority of humanity. At stake is the future shape of Asia and its relations among nations. Now, the Indian subcontinent be the crucible of the monsoon. In its simplest definition, the monsoon be a seasonal prevailing wind. There are other monsoons in northern Australia and in North America. None is as pronounced, as marked in its reversal between wet and dry seasons, as the South Asian monsoon. Over 70% of total rainfall in South Asia occurs just 3 months each year, between June and September. Now, Daniel Arola, the Kali Maestro, the master of the art of the Kali self-defense method of the Filipino martial arts, says that he learned Burmese Bando from a former Gurkha in the 1990s. He does relate that he was an interesting character. He's still not sure how much to believe when he used to tell him about training assassins in India and converting some Punjabs into spies. But that, of course, is fascinating, and I thank him for sharing that. I take most of what such men say seriously, and it's an honor for Mr. Arola to have had experience with that individual. That's historic. Every one of these individuals is a personification of history that it needs to be treasured. And of course, as much as can be recorded from them must be done before they deprive us of their asset of historical relation forever by their passing from the mortal coil. Now, as I said, over 70% of total rainfall in South Asia occurs during just 3 months each year, between June and September, and even within that period, rainfall is not consistent. It's compressed into just 100 hours of torrential rain across the summer months. So what we have is basically 100 hours a year of rain from which to water all of the crops that are harvested to feed well over 2 billion people within that arc of Indo-Asia. Now, despite a vast expansion in irrigation since 1947, when India became independent of the motherfucking Brits and the Raj came to an end, 60% of Indian agriculture remains rain-fed, and agriculture employs about half of India's population, as was stated in that very educational, wonderful piece by Goldman Sachs on monsoon India. Half of India's population is subsistence farming and are farming to feed other people as well. So they're not subsisting, they're actually producing the food which everyone needs to eat aside themselves. So all of that is rain-fed. Unlike China, unlike most large nations across the globe, India's population will continue to be predominantly rural until the mid-21st century. So unlike the rest of the surface of the world, India is not developing at astronomical pace, nor should it. That level of industrialization would kill us all. Literally, we would choke in Indian shit, industrial effluvia. Thankfully, they're slow. But like the tortoise, they may get there after the rest of us burn ourselves out. At any rate, be that as it may, no comparably large number of human beings anywhere in the world is so dependent on such intensely seasonal rainfall as the well over 1 billion people living in India. In the first decade of the 20th century, the finance minister in the imperial government declared that every budget is a gamble on the rains. More than a century later, the leading environmental activist, Sunita Narain, reversed the terms, but retained the substance of that observation. She declared, India's finance minister is the monsoon. Climate is woven into the fabric of Indian social, economic, and political thought in a way that it is not or is no longer so anywhere else in the world. In the late 20th century, that claim of the money be the monsoon would have raised hackles among scholars of South Asia. It might still do so today. A fundamental assumption of modernity was that we had mastered nature. The notion of India in thrall to the monsoon would seem to perpetuate a colonial idea of India's irredeemable backwardness. To emphasize the power of the monsoon would be to portray Indian lives as so many marionettes moved by a climatic puppet master. That is how this story would have been understood a generation ago. But now, alarmed by the planetary crises of climate change, which will impact India more than any other nation on the surface of the world, this reminder of nature's power, the monsoon, has different implications entirely. This isn't a story of geography as destiny. It's a story of how the idea of geography as destiny provoked, from the mid-19th century on, an entire series of social, political, and technological responses within and beyond ancient India. because the South Asian monsoon has effects far beyond South Asia. We know this, at least in part, because of climate research undertaken in India in the 20th century. Sir Gilbert Walker, a pioneer of global climate science, wrote in 1927 that the climate of India is of special interest, not merely as that of the greatest tropical region in the British Empire, but also because it seems to have been designed by nature with the object of demonstrating physical processes on a huge scale. That sense of scientific opportunity, combined with the pressing material need to understand the monsoon, inspired a century of study in India itself. Now, Charles Norman, Walker's successor as head of the Indian Weather Service, insisted that the monsoon be an active, not a passive feature in worldwide weather. And subsequent research has confirmed this perspective of his. The Asian monsoon is entwined with many aspects of our global climate. It has an important influence on global atmospheric circulation. The future behavior of the South Asian monsoon has implications for the entire planet and everyone living on its surface. Arguably, no other part of the global climate system affects more people more directly. The breakthroughs in tropical meteorology of the late 20th century shed new light on the scale and complexity of internal variability in the monsoon on multiple timescales, from the quasi-periodic impact of the El Niño southern oscillation system to the tropical weather fluctuation pattern known as the Madden-Julian oscillation. In recent years, the focus of scientific research has been on how the effects of anthropogenic, that means man-made, climate change interact with the monsoon's natural variability in dangerous and unpredictable ways. The most fundamental forces driving the monsoon be the thermal contrast between the land and the ocean and the availability of moisture. Climate change affects both of these drivers of wind and rain. The warming of the ocean's surface be likely to augment the amount of moisture the monsoon rains pick up on their journey toward the Indian subcontinent. But if the ocean surface warms more rapidly than the land, which appears to be happening in equatorial waters, this would narrow the temperature gradient that drives the winds, and so weaken circulation. Put simply, many climate models predict that the first of these processes will predominate. Wet gets wetter as a result of greenhouse gas emissions. These models predict, that is to say, that the moist monsoon lands will see an increase in rainfall. But the monsoon is an intricate phenomenon, as the meteorologists have long known. It's increasingly clear that monsoon rainfall is affected not only by planetary warming, but also by transformations on a regional scale, including the emission of aerosols from vehicles, crop burning, and domestic fires, and changes in land use. So the urgent challenge for climate science be to disentangle and to understand these global and regional influences on the behavior of the monsoon. And so far, the monsoon has proved much harder to capture in models than, say, global temperatures. The availability of detailed records of climate and rainfall in India, which themselves are a product of the history of Indian meteorology going back to the efforts of Henry Blanford and his colleagues in the late 19th century, have allowed scientists to reconstruct in detail the monsoon's behavior over the past 60 years. The picture these data present be complex and in some ways surprising. Average summer rainfall over India has declined by around 7% since 1950. The cause of this downward trend in rainfall lies in the pattern of India's development since independence. Its explanation, that be to say, lies in the province of economic history. In the late 1990s, research vessels observed exceptionally high concentrations of aerosols in the northern Indian Ocean. Satellite images showed a stain that spread across the Indo-Gangetic Plain and over the Indian Ocean. Researchers called it the brown cloud, an accurate if not very poetic, description of the haze. Between January and March of 1999, a large team of investigators set out to understand this brown cloud, taking readings from their base at the Kashidu Observatory in one of the most remote islands of the Maldives island chain, which stretches all the way from southern India to the equator itself, in the form of course, that island on the equator, the Chagos Archipelago, occupied by the United States, leased from the British Empire. To this day, all of its black African, these are ultimately African indigenous peoples that had sailed and settled there thousands of years agone, having been driven into exile and deported to make room for the white war machine of motherfucking American Empire. Now, the project of meteorological measurement was led, once it was established, by a Veerabhadran Ramanathan, an Indian oceanographer based at the Scripps Institute in La Jolla, California, which is how I know of him. He's one of the men that I contacted in my last year as a Department of Defense research librarian, fresh out of dishonorably discharged service from the Marine Corps in the last year that the Presidio military base was open prior its beginning the closure process based on everything I had exposed when I had one last opportunity to look at the world of military criminality fall apart. And at that time, one of the scientists involved was the Dutch atmospheric chemist Paul Crutzen, who around the same time also coined the term Anthropocene, man-made environmental epoch, referring to this new geological time span, an age, like the age of the dinosaurs, in which human activity be the most important influence on all of planet Earth's physical processes, with the impact of a planetoid strike, like a meteor crash or a planetary collision, as if the moon had crashed into the Earth. And their project found that the haze was a noxious composite of sulfate, nitrate, black carbon, dust, and fly ash, as well as naturally occurring aerosols, including sea salt and mineral dust. 3/4 of the composition of the brown cloud could be attributed directly to human activity, especially concentrated along the densely populated Indo-Gangetic Plain in northwestern India. In this region, where up to 80% of the population remains rural, countryside, farmers, and where many rural families continue to be deprived entirely of electricity. Much of the black carbon is produced by domestic burning of biomass, fireplace wood, crop residue, dung. They burn dung for warmth, animal shit, and coal, all used primarily for cooking. Open crop burning accounts for the rest. The stoves used in households are inefficient and combustion is incomplete, producing large amounts of soot. Now, apart from their likely effects on regional climate, these emissions also poison human bodies. By one estimate, well over 400,000 premature deaths each and every year in India can be attributed to indoor pollution. Black carbon combines in the brown cloud with sulfates and other aerosols, and the Indo-Gangetic Plain bears an additional burden in this respect as a result of pockets of intensive industrial and extractive activity. Now, since the late 19th century, the Indo-Gangetic Plain has been the core region of India's extractive industries, built around the rich coal and mineral deposits in the Chota-Nagpur region. Further along the Yamuna River, the Delhi region be one of India's fastest growing metropolitan areas, and its largest in absolute terms. Emissions have increased exponentially since the 1970s as India's population has grown, as its economy has expanded, as inequalities within and among regions have widened. The Indo-Gangetic Plain suffers from a double pathology. The sulfur, carbon, and nitrogen dioxide emissions that accompany energy-intensive growth are combined with the black carbon that comes from the use of cheaper, dirtier fuels by millions of impoverished peasants without any access whatsoever to electricity. All of this is shifting the monsoon's patterns. Aerosols absorb solar radiation, allowing less of it to reach the Earth's surface. This cools the land, diminishes the temperature contrast between the land and sea, and weakens the atmospheric circulation that sustains the summer monsoon. Changes in circulation over the Indian subcontinent, in turn, affect the tightly integrated air-sea interaction that binds the Asian continent with the Indian Ocean, a system that already contains plenty of internal variability. Because of the way the Asian monsoon is linked to other parts of the world's climate, it is entirely possible and likely probable that aerosols over South Asia have global consequences. When all these effects are coupled with the impact of global warming on the ocean and the atmosphere, the instabilities multiply. Far from counteracting the effect of greenhouse gases in any simple sense, the impact of aerosols complicates them. A further driver of regional climate change is absolute changes in land use, which are occurring at all too fast a rapidity. Over the past 150 years, forest cover over most parts of Asia has declined dramatically. The intensification of agricultural production in India and the use of more water for irrigation has affected the moisture of the soil, its capacity to absorb or reflect heat. Crops reflect more solar radiation than forests, which tend to absorb it. The greater reflexivity of land planted with crops makes it cooler, once again weakening the temperature differentials that drive circulation and rainfall. The tropical meteorologist Deepti Singh points out that climate models have all failed to predict the monsoon's behavior, in part because they be too abstract to take into account the complex topography, temperature, and moisture gradients in the region that can influence the monsoon circulation. For me to simplify that for you, the models omit, that is, precisely the details of landscape and microclimate that the meteorologists of a century earlier were so deeply interested in, which they depicted in their detailed local and regional maps of India's climate, but have never been entered into computers. So we're left with the most bitter of ironies. Many of the measures taken to secure India against the vagaries of the monsoon in the second half of the 20th century, intensive irrigation, the planting of new crops, have, through a cascade of unintended consequences, destabilized the monsoon itself. When the geographers of the early 20th century wrote of Monsoon Asia, as my father, the combat sailor, spoke of, men like him and these scientists both saw the monsoon as sovereign. It shaped the lives of hundreds of millions of people who waited on its every move. Monsoon Asia means something quite different now in my time, and yours, when the monsoon's behavior, increasingly erratic, responds to human intervention. So, the people who, of course, did this to India, who destroyed India, who committed the most massive genocide in human history, parallel to that of Mao Zedong and his Communist Party in mainland China, or Joseph Stalin and his Soviet collectivization in motherfucking Russia, be the goddamn Brits. And today, of course, they're engaged in their own auto-destruction that most Americans have no care for. But every American should care about Brexit. It's very hard to get any American even excited about Brexit. So what I'm going to try and do is stimulate your interest with 6 factors that immediately come to mind for me. Because the time to care about Brexit be now. Unless Britain gets an extension, or there's another major plot twist, it's set to leave the European Union on March 29th. But of course, the biggest problem on this side of the Atlantic be the fact that men like myself have ignored it for so long in terms of articulating its importance because of our own immediate issues as jacked by the motherfucking Russians here this side of the Atlantic. But the Russians jacked Brexit. They hacked into the British system using Cambridge Analytica, just like they did in the United States to hack Trump into power. So with our own problems, our own death as a republic on this side of the Atlantic, how can an American or anyone really make sense of Brexit? And why should one want to, that is, in a visceral, emotional way that goes beyond a duty to understand what's going on in the world and the global economy? And the Brits themselves don't always make it easy. Last week, Prime Minister Theresa May brought to the House of Commons the deal that she had made with the European Union, or it might have been the week before. I do a lot of drugs, and I have to remain back together again when I come out of blackout. But sometime in the last 14 nights or fortnight, Theresa May brought to the House of Commons the deal that she had made with the European Union on the terms of Brexit exit, only to have it voted down by a historic margin. And the very next day, within 24 hours, she won what was essentially a total no confidence vote. So it can feel like the wheels just spin. But if you're ever going to care, the time be now, because of the immediacy of Brexit manifest, of it all coming down. Now, I know for a fact that certainly if I'm in any way, shape, or form genetically related to my late and sainted sire, George Joseph Henry Dietrich, and if not, certainly acculturated by him, I was raised to identify with Ireland. And if you're any American who knows about John F. Kennedy and feels some affinity for him and his life and his dynasty, then you care about Ireland. And if you're an average American, the overwhelming majority of you European Americans, you Caucasian whites, are going to have some Irish blood. So, do you care about Ireland? Then you most definitively care about Brexit. That's one of the quickest measures, perhaps, of your capacity to be stirred up by Brexit, is whether you have an emotional response to the quote, I'm about to paraphrase, which the British Broadcasting Company attributed to a Tory grande, as they used that term. I'm not really quite sure what that means, to tell you the truth, but I do remember the quote. And it be that the Irish really should know their place. Now, that's offensive as anything can ever be coming from the mouth of a goddamn Brit, considering the centuries of genocidal, mass murderous conspiracy by British Empire against the Irish people. The grande in question apparently was outraged that the government of the Republic of Ireland seemed to be a real player in determining the European Union's priorities in its divorce negotiations with Britain. Or, if you're an American, how would you react to the Tory Brexiteer Minister of Parliament, the MP, who wondered publicly why possible food shortages in Ireland weren't being used as a leverage in those negotiations? In other words, he was hearkening back to the good old days when they could generate potato famines by conspiracy in Ireland, kill millions of Irish people, and then get their way in their evil British objectives and agendas. So in light of this pure, raw British genetic evil, they're racially evil people. They know that. They don't take offense. They're proud of it. They take what I say as a compliment. So don't dwell on it. But in light of that, Ireland's influence should not have been a surprise. The Republic of Ireland is a member in good standing in the European Union. If Brexit means having a new hard border with Europe, it means having a new hard border with the Republic of Ireland. And yet 2.5 years after the referendum that set Brexit in motion passed, the British still, in effect, haven't worked out where to put the motherfucking border. There'd be two options. The border control line could run through the island of Ireland, separating the Republic from the counties of Northern Ireland, which be part of Britain. But that would upend the commitments that Britain made in 1998 as part of the Good Friday Peace Accords, which rely on free movement and led to the creation of common institutions across both parts of the island. The Good Friday agreements were brokered with the help of the United States and seemed to bring an end to a centuries-long conflict in which many Americans were, to say the very least, based on what I've articulated about the Kennedy dynasty, quite emotionally invested, and financially so as well, with the finance out of the United States of either the Catholics or the Protestants in Ireland, which was basically, in essence, a religious war. A lot of you don't remember that. We're going to return to that here, the religious war. Now, the idea that the peace could be so ceaselessly, carelessly treated, be more than maddening. It's a chronically maddening aspect that the Brits, like the Americans, break every treaty that they render with people that they consider abject savages. In the American case, it was Native Americans. In the case of the Anglo-Saxon Brits, it was the Celts, whether in Wales or Scotland or the island of Ayr. Now, for a sense of what a return to the Troubles, and this is what the Irish used to call it, and the British and everyone else referred to it as the time of Troubles, the sad struggle. For a sense of what a return to that might cost, you might get yourself a copy of a book that I think is coming out next month. It's not published yet, but it's entitled Say Nothing, as in back in the day when everybody just wouldn't talk about it. That's why the book is titled Say Nothing. It's written by an author named Patrick Radden Keefe, surname spelled K-E-E-F-E. Patrick Radden Keefe, and his book Say Nothing. I look forward to it when it comes out. Now, the new border control line could also be formed by the Irish Sea, but this would leave Northern Ireland in the European Union, or at least under more European Union rules than the rest of Britain. And for many in Northern Ireland, such separate but unequal status, non-equal, would be anathema. One of the fixtures of the parliamentary debates on Brexit has been the grim faces of the 10 members of Northern Ireland's DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party, who look as if they suspect that at any moment they're about to be betrayed. Now, I've never been able to pronounce the name of the party affiliated with the Irish Republican Army, which is spelled S-I-N-N space F-E with an accent I-N. I keep wanting to say Sinn Féin, but the Celtic language is never pronounced the way it's spelled. I think it's something like Seinfeld, like Seinfeld. I do apologize for mispronouncing it. I know I'm butchering it. Any true Gaelic speaker out there, I'll check in with them at some point. Send me private messages with audio clips. I'll be happy to review them. Finally learn how to pronounce the Sinn Féin party correctly. They won 7 Northern Irish seats, but their members remain absent in a rejection of the British Parliament's authority. And that should show you just how tense and how fucked up and waiting to explode all over again the situation be in Northern Ireland. So Theresa May's deal has not at all settled the Irish border question. It's just pushed the problem back a couple of years. The DUP, the Democratic Unionist Party of Ireland, voted against that deal and then backed May in the no confidence vote, which she would have lost otherwise. She won only because of the Northern Irish backing her up because they feared the alternative more in terms of the out-and-out communist, Jeremy Corbyn. Now, the European Union insisted on an insurance policy known as backstop, which would keep all of the United Kingdom tied to Europe until the Irish question be settled. Opposition to the backstop is probably the biggest reason that Theresa May's Brexit deal failed. Brexiteers in her party argue that she can get a better bargain, in part because they don't believe that the European Union really, truly cares about Ireland. That's their fucking insanity. Because the European Union very much cares about Ireland, because people are trying to escape the United Kingdom by defecting to Southern Ireland, or the Republic of Ireland, the main body of Ireland's geography, true Ireland, as opposed to Northern Ireland, which of course is technically part of the United Kingdom. And people are trying to escape into Ireland out of the United Kingdom because they see everything in the United Kingdom is going to shit. And they know that Ireland is now, along with Scotland, but mostly Ireland right now, because Scotland's not yet free of England, not yet truly independent, but Ireland is. And Ireland is a solid member in good standing with the European Union, and therefore, the best economy in the world right now for expansion, for establishment of new businesses in the English-speaking world are the English-speaking Irish realm, or it's the English-speaking Irish realm of mainland Ireland, majority Ireland, Hibernia. And it's there, of course, we give a shout out to Tori, our lovely lady over there, Tony, and I'm forgetting her last name at the moment, but God, I did an interview with her. She's the only person I know who actually likes that poor bastard who wound up in jail, Mr. Sean David Morton. I've got nothing against him myself, but then again, he never ripped me off for my life savings. Tony Leslie. Who lists herself as in Turnasar, land of the free, which is, of course, an ancient name of Ireland. God love her. And shout out to her, lovely lady, and of true royal descent, actually a princess, in a sense, of the Celtic peoples over there in Ireland. I'll have to speak to her some more sometime about that. Some Jewish blood in there, too, by the way. Anyhow, wonderful human being. And if she's listening, she'll understand all too painfully everything I'm speaking about. And she will, of course, confirm that if you want to go to a place where they speak English, actual English, not like what they do, of course, in nothing against the people themselves, but there's very few people in Pakistan or India or any of these places that are hired out for bottom of the dollar by medical industries and information industries to basically handle tech support for you. So you can't understand a word they're fucking saying. The same people who call you up and tell you that you owe millions of dollars to the IRS and that you're going to go to jail if you don't send them all your money. Yeah, those people, they don't speak English you can understand. The Irish people do. And so the only place where you can go if you want to start up and you get English-speaking people who really speak English, who don't charge you an arm and a leg and rip you off the way the Brits do, the only place to go with European Union standards for fair trade is Ireland. Yeah, I know. People say Canada, but, there's all kinds of... We'll go into that later. Not in this transmission. One of these days, Pavel will tell you about that. He would know. His parents work for the government. At any rate, when it comes to Ireland, that being, I think, beaten to death at the moment, say that you're a different type of European American or a different type of white Caucasian here in the United States. Maybe you would care about Scotland, or Italy, or Greece, or Sweden. Scotland was one of the many parts of the United Kingdom that favored Remain in the 2016 referendum, but it has a particular complaint. 2 years earlier, there had been a referendum on Scottish independence, and many in Scotland voted against it on the premise that staying with Britain meant staying in the European Union. And Brexit felt to them exactly what it was, a bait-and-switch swindle. So Scottish ministers of parliament are now among those pressing hard for a second Brexit referendum to overturn the first. If they don't get it, they'll likely want another try at independence, and they'll win this time so they can sever from motherfucking Britain to stay in the European Union, where the economy actually functions, as opposed to in the dying, atrophied part of an empire of idiots torn asunder by the motherfucking Russians, who have taken over and hijacked their PCs and their internet and turned them into a bunch of white trash pieces of shit worshipping Vladimir Putin. And similarly in Scotland, to avoid the Putinista plague that's overwhelmed the South, everything south of their border, Sinn Féin, which my executive producer, Pavel Edward Pravara, says he pronounces Sinn Féin, or something like that, has called for a unity referendum in the case of a hard Good Friday incompatible Brexit in Scotland. Now, referendums can beget more referendums. That's why they call them never-endums. So the mess of Brexit might produce the possibility that there will be a run of departures, that an Italexit, Grexit, or Swexit will be next, to say the least, in the short run. In other words, everyone will see how fucked up this is and say, well, we aren't going to make a run for it. We're going to stay on the leash, bound to the sun by gravity of the greater iron cross of German unification. But the issues that drove the Leave vote on those wretched Isles of England, such as hostility to immigrants and to European institutions, all propagandized by the motherfucking Russians. None of these biases have been resolved. None of these phobias have been resolved. In Italy, for example, Euroscepticism has been particularly strong. And so all of this will continue to fester, to just steam and simmer within the European Union, within the shithole nations that surround the fatherland. Now, all these impulses, of course, are not confined to Europe, which bring us myself to the next challenge of whether or not you feel yet that this involves you. Do you have fears about or hopes for what they call populism in the most backwards sense of reversing truth upon its head and inverting reality? Because there's nothing popular about this so-called populism. It's not majoritarianism. It is elitism of the ignorant. If you're that kind of reactionary nationalist, do you have fears or hope for that phenomenon in America? Donald Trump has, characteristically and unconvincingly, claimed credit for Brexit. So it's fair to say that both his election and the Brexit vote were influenced by the same transnational forces. And this is the insanity of it. That Russian transnationalism is what it's play here. Russian transnationalism, which claims to be on the side of reactionary nationalism. Now, all of this Russophiliac, right-wing, or reactionary nationalist, in disambiguation from National Socialist populism, is afoot in many countries. There was even a Cambridge Analytica angle in the Brexit referendum campaign that I went to in depth in a number of my past transmissions when I was still affiliated with Revolution Radio, as a matter of fact. And Brexit may offer a preview of what it looks like when a populist dream fails. Theresa May has spoken of how explosive it might be for Britain's elites to simply ignore the referendum's verdict. Where would voters go? what is at the heart of their discontent? Would they, faced with realities and moral insights, now vote yes? Or would they see a second referendum as an attempt to subvert the popular will, which of course never existed and was simply a Russian hack? Or will they dangerously lose faith in the electoral process altogether? And of course turn away from electoral politics towards autocracy as promoted by Vladimir Putin. How about populism on the left? These are all questions for Britain, and as Trump lurches from one crisis to the next, for the United States. Whatever happens on March 29th to the Brits and what they've fucked themselves up the ass with is going to offer direct insight into how November 3rd, 2020 will look in the United States. Or do you have a penchant for dystopian scenarios? Now, Hugo Fry, an executive with the French company Sanofi, told the Wall Street Journal, the worst case for us is not that we sell a little less fizzy pop. The worst case is that the patients in England don't get any medicine. A fifth of the insulin used in ignorant Britannia is manufactured, produced, and sold on the market by Sanofi in France, which transports it from a factory where it's produced in Germany. That means that a lot of glucose suckers in England are going to die. Not to insult them, not to degrade or denigrate the condition of being a diabetic, but I've got a sour taste left in my mouth from Mike Ringley, who was an alcoholic diabetic. And of course, without relating too much in that direction, just to spare myself the memory, I see a lot of people who are self-abusive and they drive themselves into a diabetes they didn't need to suffer. In the case of Britain, I'm not saying they deserve it, but they're damn well going to get it, whether they want it or not. And if they voted for Brexit, then by God, it's Darwinian selection, and they deserve to die. Now, talk about Brexit involves a lot of discussion of logistics and supply chains. So, does any decent post-apocalyptic thriller? What if traffic can't move because the motorways are backed up at the ports? What would happen if suddenly no planes have permission to land in Britain because the European Union landing rules haven't been replaced by new ones? What might confusion about quarantines mean in context of an actual epidemic? How about rolling blackouts? Now, all these very pertinent and relevant questions have been entirely mooted, but it's not clear how much has been done to address these very realistic scenarios, or even to dispel fears about the more fantastical ones, or to even figure out which be which. One way or another, Brexit will have a profound effect on the ways that people live and on the choices that they have. There be a consensus that everything will be more chaotic in the event of a no-deal Brexit or a cliff-edge Brexit, which will occur if the day of Brexit arrives and the European Union and Theresa May can't agree on something that Parliament will accept. Unfortunately, avoiding a no-deal Brexit requires a British government that can operate properly, and the current level of dysfunction be quite high, indeed historic. It's never been this bad. Parliament has descended into farce. And of course, that raises another observation. Do you enjoy a good farce? If none of this concerns you, does it at least amuse you? Has it come to your attention that in the course of the Brexit debate, a Labour Minister of Parliament named Lloyd Russell Moyle attempted to abscond with the ceremonial mace, a big gilded thing that somehow represents the Queen's power in Parliament? The Sergeant-at-Arms, a woman dressed in black, wearing a sword, stopped him at sword point. And then he went to a pub.
as the incident unfolded, there was a call of order, order. No, 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 no. That's what they said. Those words were uttered by John Bercow, the Speaker of the House of Commons, who shouts of order and demands for Zen. That's like meditation to you kids out there who don't know that word Zen. It's like Buddhist meditation. He demanded it. Like you could just, assume the position. At any rate, that was a spectacle within a spectacle. So the Guardian ran a piece about the continental European fascination with Bercow, citing a supercut of his antics put together by a German television news program, which I think was like something like 10 minutes of no, 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 like some woman getting raped up the ass. It might be good to watch alongside a piece entitled Brexit, the Uncivil War, which features Benedict Cumberbatch as one of the engineers of the Leave campaign, which I believe is currently airing on HBO, because they took House of Cards off after the guy turned out to have apologized for assaulting a young boy, and then, he takes it back now and declares himself not guilty. But anyhow, I think that was HBO, wasn't it? Was that Netflix? Either rate, I don't have a television. Now, Bercow also called in lip-reading experts to determine whether Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party leader, we call him communist in the United States, muttered "stupid woman" as Theresa May spoke, or if, as Corbyn claimed, he said "stupid people." Nobody seems certain, by the way. The lip readers weren't able to finalize that judgment for us. Now, for that matter, as the BBC noted, the Queen may be dragged in, with her gavel and all. For example, if Corbyn successfully calls a no-confidence vote, again, if they rerun it, and it emerges that neither he nor anyone else clearly has Parliament's confidence, even if Theresa May got no confidence all the way and had to turn in her resignation to the Queen, then it would be the Queen herself who would have to make a guess as to who had the best chance and give that person a try. This is why it's so useful to have monarchy. But is it altogether actually amusing? Or is it just plain sad? Or is it so depressing that it promotes suicide rates to rise? At least, amidst all of that, the British know how to put on a show. One of the problems with Brexit, though, from beginning to end, has been the careless theatricality of the politicians. Whether Corbyn or the Brexiteers Boris Johnson and Jacob Rees-Mogg, who have been entrusted with what should be deemed matters that are not simply very important to state, but matters that are important to their own fucking population and the survival thereof. And, of course, Britain's own place on the world scene. Whether or not it even remains a player or becomes a neo-Soviet satellite state. But that's no reason to look away. After all, tragedies can be pretty compelling too. Brexit is also, at the bottom of it all, human drama. And one of the shocks of the referendum for the saner Europeans, the people on the continent, looking on with shock and awe and wonder, and the fascination of an airplane crash or a train wreck at the British Isles while they burn, be that the bonds between them be more fragile than anyone on either side of the channel had ever been led to believe. Maybe Europe isn't what they, or Americans, thought. Perhaps something intricate and valuable that took decades to construct is about to be sundered. So watch if you can bear the pain. Because it's like watching an American bombing of Iraq or the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. This is Vladimir Putin's new Cold War equivalent. of the Soviet invasion of Western Europe. And it was the Brits who opened the gates and let his Trojan horse in. So the one thing we can all conclude is they deserve everything they get. And on this side of the Atlantic, we're going to find the people guilty easily in the open. They're called Republicans, Independents, vanguarded by the National Rifle Association. And these people must face justice and mass deportation. A severance of the South, not because Dixie wins its goddamn independence, but because they're no longer wanted as part of the United States, will be in order. All of this rooted in what can be summed up in one single word: xenophobia. Just how much are the United Kingdom and the United States ready to sacrifice in order to keep their neighbors out? Because both nations are ending yet another tense week of trying to answer this question. Yet another tense month, a year, that this has been going on ever since the Russians put their man in the White House. In the United Kingdom, Prime Minister Theresa May barely survived her no-confidence vote with the help of the Irish Democratic Unionist Party. And her empire still has no Brexit deal, nor any clarity on whether it should continue with the process. So far, that process has contributed to the economy of British Empire suffering a 2.1% contraction. And a no-deal Brexit could make the situation worse than it was in 2008. All while Vladimir Putin sits back and laughs and waits to move in as the great white savior of white trash sewage humanity, subhumanity. Meanwhile, the United States is enduring the longest ever government shutdown, which has left 800,000 federal workers without pay, has already cost the economy well over $6 billion United States dollars, as the white trash president holds the budget hostage over his campaign promise of a wall on the southern border. Eventually, this shutdown will push the United States into recession. All because of motherfucking Trump promising a wall for Vladimir Putin. And all the white trash pieces of shit who just groove off of a Berlin graffiti-strewn mass of concrete blocking out the sun where they don't have to look at it. Brexit, the shutdown, the war, these all stem from the same political pursuit to keep immigrants out. The issue's been sold as economic. People worried for their jobs, their savings, their welfare. But given the losses that supporters of Brexit and the wall are willing to accept, it's increasingly indisputable, inarguable, incontrovertible. Economics has nothing to do with this. It's an economic abyss. It's only xenophobia that be at the core. For you ignoramuses out there who are vocabulary poor, xenophobia be a composite of two words from ancient Greek, one meaning fear, and the other stranger or enemy. But as we watch these governments bend over backwards to keep out a relatively small number of foreigners, the term xenophobia, meaning fear of the stranger, the fear part proves itself. It doesn't seem to be the right word in English. It doesn't meet the circumstances. It doesn't satisfy the needed definition. Hatred does. A hatred of the foreigner portrayed as an enemy, as dangerous, ill-intentioned, and undeserving. And not just any foreigner. The poor, the jobless, and ever and always the non-white, also the non-Christian. Trump recently tweeted about prayer rugs allegedly found at the border. The ultimate sign of its dangerousness. People bowing towards Mecca. All this be beyond ironic, given what both these governments on either side of the Atlantic are hanging themselves up for. A hatred that's quietly growing so large, it's destroying all their stability from within. All for fear of someone coming from the outside to do the same, and all propagandized by the greatest alien race hater of them all. The phobic in every sense of the word, homophobic, xenophobic, pathological madman known as Vladimir Putin, advised by a literal Satanist, his Rasputin known as Alexander Dugin, introduced by the Russian asset Alex Jones as Putin's brain, a co-religionist and cultist of Michael Aquino. You are in the hands, passed on from Satan to the anti-gods beyond the abyss. And in this light, we turn towards the Galatees, the Supreme Court. President Trump's controversial transgender military ban will go into effect while it works its way through the courts. The Supreme Court allowed the ban to start, but took no stance on its legality. That's the Kavanaugh Court of reactionaries installed by President Trump. This is a blow to human rights activists, and particularly to the lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender population who consider the ban to be cruel and irrational. Meanwhile, the court will take up a Second Amendment case for the first time in almost a decade. The case be a challenge to a part of New York City's gun law, which regulates where gun owners can take their firearms. It's significant because this is the first substantive gun rights case that the Supremes have taken up with its new reactionary majority installed and beholden to executive dictator and Putinista puppet Donald Trump. And I'll bet your sweet ass that whatever's going to come down, it's going to serve motherfucking Russia in their waging war against you. Now, I've brought up before, this is the war of Antichrist. What's particularly tragic is that many younger people cannot accept that because they don't believe in Antichrist. They don't believe in God. The Civil War, the original Civil War, we all remember, that war between two separate nations, the Confederate States of America and the United States of America, was not really civil, but it's known as a war between the states because, of course, the North insists that the Confederate States of America was never real, that it was not legitimate, that it was states in rebellion. Of course, I've always taken the perspective that it's two separate nations and that the Confederate States are currently occupied, which is why I'm more than willing to acknowledge and advocate their secession. It's not that they're not needed by the United States anymore. It's that, as far as I'm concerned, they're not wanted. And a new Africa comes into being of the black counties, comprising the black belt of black counties throughout the Deep South, and the remainder peripheries of white bastions will be part of a new confederacy. Not necessarily geographically all linked. They will have to communicate and economically work with each other through arrangements that will probably involve a third party, likely in alliance with Russia, which they're more than welcome to, as I'm willing to deport the majority of Republicans in the North to Greater Manchuria so they can live in the Russia they so worship. But all of this will be resultant a new civil war. A civil war that, like the original Civil War, will be not just a race war, as the original Civil War was, not a war between black and white, but between the overwhelmingly ethnic Anglo-Dutch of the North and the overwhelmingly ethnic Gallo-Celts of the South, who fought in a race war to the death that was a repeat in many ways of the Anglo extermination against the Celtic fringe on the Isles of Britannia. Only this time, the Anglo-Teutonic, Dutch, acculturated, puritanical North, industrialized on the basis of the Protestant work ethic, was overwhelming in its assault against the agrarian, manse and estate-oriented economy of the Gallo-Celtic southern peoples, considered a very different race from the Yankees north of the Mason-Dixon line. But more so than a race war, the Civil War that anticipated this Civil War, provoked as it is by motherfucking Russia in our age, the Civil War of yore was a religious war. Like Bosnia, Herzegovina, the secession wars of the former Federative Socialist Republic of Yugoslavia, it was an ethno-religious conflict, like all conflicts on the periphery of the former Soviet Union into all the borderlands of the world. Ethno-religious conflict is the dominant theme of almost any conflict in human history. So the way to see the Civil War is not simply from the ethnic composition of the demographies, the populations of North and South, but to see it as a theological crisis. The Enlightenment historian Edward Gibbon pointed out with some ridicule that in the Arian controversy, Christianity got into a disputation over the smallest letter in the Greek alphabet, the iota, the period. At the Council of Nicaea, Arians, that's a religious order, not the race as in Aryans. It's not spelled A-R-Y-A-N-S for a plural. It's spelled A-R-I-A-N-S for a plural. The Arian Theosophic movement. Now, at the Council of Nicaea, where we kind of created Christianity as we know it today as a church formatted faith, it's where the church was born, where the church was established, constructed. And at the Council of Nicaea, Arians wanted the word homeoousios, that's how I remember it, meaning similar substance. It's homeoousios, like homogeneous, like homogeneous. Oh, homeoousios. It's spelled H-O-M-O-I-O-U-S-I-O-S, if I remember correctly. And I never got the pronunciation. But homeoousios, meaning similar substance or like kind of homogeneity. It got inserted into the creed concerning the nature of Christ. And the Arians were comfortable thinking of Jesus in divine terms, but not as an equal to the Father, God, the divinity, the creator, in his essence. So led by Athanasius, the Orthodox contingent objected, that's part of the church which ultimately Douglas Dietrich was baptized into in Serbia. The Orthodox contingent objected, insisting that the word homeousios, meaning same substance, meant that God and Son, that Son of God, was God. That homeousios, which is spelled differently from homeousios, it's spelled H-O-M-O-O-U-S-I-O-S, S-I-O-U-S, something like insidious. Anyhow, homoousios meant that same substance would prevail over similar substance. That Jesus was God the man. Now, for Gibbon, the man who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and other Enlightenment-oriented thinkers, thousands of years later, this all seemed too much ado about nothing. Such minutiae, such trifling, that they would upset things so unnecessarily as to almost kill the church in its inception. Strikes us as surreal, as a form of insanity. Now, given that Gibbon liked nothing better than a well-oiled worldly machine, he saw the controversy as so many wrenches in the works. Of course, Gibbon missed the point entirely. The difference between viewing Christ as fully God, as opposed to merely godlike, changes one's conception of the entire universe, of creation, and of history itself. If we were to have accepted the Arian heresy, and they ultimately were considered, they were ultimately condemned as a heresy, and homoousios, the similar substance theology or theosophy, since they were heretical, was exiled into an underworld cult. If we had taken their definition, we would view Jesus Christ the way we view Hercules today. In other words, we would think of him as half man, half God, a figure of comic books and television serials, someone that would provide entertainment in his accomplishments of yore, but we would see no reason to worship him. Because of the church winning this internecine conflict at conception, and our acceptance of the word with the iota, the homoousios, we see Jesus Christ as God. This created your universe, your world. So, Gibbon, of course, despite being an intellectual giant, was a ruddy, bloody, muddy fool. An absolute idiot, lacking any common sense. When it comes to our theological understanding, what we worship will have dramatic consequences on the basis of every word, which is why the King James Version of the Bible is to be taken out on your backyard barbecue and burned, and get yourself a copy of the English version of the Nuremberg Bible, which served man well for centuries, and that will be the salvation of your soul. Because, of course, of the changes and deceptions propagated by King James, most Protestants have been led down to the path where now they worship not even the Antichrist, but merely the bitch of the Antichrist harbinger, Donald Trump, as their mulligan man. We'll get back to that in a moment. But in the meantime, so that you understand the concept of the meaning of definition and how this can define your world and why you war in your world, I've always known, even before I got a theological education the wrong way, just as I got into medical education the wrong way by being a care provider and forced by circumstance to be an advocate for my late and sainted parents, so too I got theological education the wrong way by liaison status under orders to Michael Aquino, learning about your cosmos from the dark side. I always knew, even before then, that understanding religious belief forms the key to understanding any event in history, be it great or small. this be more easily seen in the ancient world, where religion showed on the sleeves much more so than today. But men are men, and as a man thinks, so he is. That's Proverbs, chapter 23, verse 7. Now, Mark Noll is an author. He points out the religious roots and the religious mistakes of both North and South in his excellent work, a book I finally got around to reading after it sat in my stockpile, my Order's Crypt, for what must have been years by now, entitled The Civil War as a Theological Crisis. Again, the author's name is Mark Noll, his surname spelled N-O-L-L. Now, Mark Noll's analysis gets to the heart of the real differences between North and South, aside from race, and shows how these religious differences formed the roots of the political disagreements that led to war. Both sides professed belief in the authority of the Bible, and both sides reached starkly different conclusions, antithetical conclusions. That's obvious to anyone, but Noll's approach demonstrates these different interpretations came from the same source. And that's what makes this very brief and easy to read work a real treasure. By 1850, America experienced a deep political crisis, but astute observers of the day saw that the roots went deeper. A Protestant ethos merged nicely with democratic principles in America quite easily. The individual should be able to read, reason, and think for himself. Now, both Protestantism and democratic government rest on the idea that truth always has a plain and obvious character. It could be argued that an agreed-upon atmosphere of sorts existed between Protestant denominations despite their differences. Noll takes that for granted, does not argue the point. But in 1844, both Methodist and Baptist churches, the largest in the United States at that time, experienced deep schisms. A broken church will lead to a broken nation, and leaders from the North and South predicted this. Henry Clay opined that this sundering of religious ties I consider the greatest source of danger to our country. In 1850, John Calhoun of South Carolina warned that if the great Protestant denominations finally broke, nothing would be left to hold the states together except force. So Noll writes, if we keep in mind that it was never only a matter of interpreting individual biblical texts, but always a question of putting actively to use the authoritative book on which the national culture of the United States had been built, then we'd be in a position to understand why in 1860 battles over the Bible were so important, why divergent views of providence cut so deeply, and why the Civil War illuminated much about the general character of religion in America. So first, the South. Southern arguments, or the proper term in the Celtic is actually Southron. Southron arguments in defense of slavery had the advantage of simplicity and the apparent strict fidelity of the biblical text. In other words, they were biblically literalist. Southrons pointed out that God allowed Israel to have slavery. Abraham and other luminaries owned slaves. That Jesus Christus, Jesus Christ himself, never condemned the institution of slavery. Nowhere in the epistles, the epistolae, be slavery ever condemned. In fact, slaves are repeatedly told to obey their masters. Paul, after finding Onesimus, an escaped slave, has him return to Philemon. Thus, to argue, as abolitionists oft did, that anyone who practiced slavery could have nothing to do with biblical Christianity flies in the face of the entire and obvious biblical teaching on slavery. The case was open and shut. Northern arguments also strove for stark clarity and simplicity. The most common arguments usually had the following characteristics, as I derive from the book. In summary, I would say, taking my notes as I have, the three that stand out to me that I can summarize in sentences would be: slavery had inextricable links to tyranny and moral abuses that the ethic of the gospel strenuously opposed. Slavery contradicted principles of justice, love, and mercy found throughout the Bible. Slavery went against the general spirit of the brotherhood of mankind, propounded by certain texts like Galatians, Book 3, Chapter 28, or Chapter 3, the book of Galatians, Chapter 3, verse 28. There you are. That's how I remember it. You can check me out on that. Now, in other words, anti-slavery arguments inevitably used first principles, but tended to avoid textual rigor and so failed to deal head-on with what pro-slavery advocates said. And furthermore, many anti-slavery arguments wedded themselves to natural reason, self-evident truths, and Republican practices, and at times relied on these ideas far more so than Scripture itself. And thusly it be that Noaught comments, the primary reason the biblical defense of slavery remained so strong was that biblical attacks on slavery were so weak. You see, this is why I had a wonderful human being who I'm going to quote, who left a wonderful comment that we have published on my latest YouTube transmission. And that's thanks to Pavel Edward Bravara, our executive producer, getting it out there so quickly. He's getting them all out very quickly these days. We're simply behind a little bit with the top sites or the topics cited in this episode list that provoke myself or prompt myself to publish the banners that promote the links to the YouTube videos that get up very quickly. So just start independently checking the YouTube yourself very quickly as soon as transmissions are over, and they should be up very shortly, barring mitigating circumstances by this point in our history of presentation and publication on the part of my executive director and myself. But one of these comments spoke of the controversy concerning Martin Luther King Jr. Being, aside from what I had already stated, we had an individual who pointed out the fact that Martin Luther King Jr. was advocating civil rights, was very focused on the litigious as opposed to the moral or the philosophical, rather than human rights, which be inalienable because we be born with them. Martin Luther King Jr. was trying to get things written in law that would be of benefit to his people and what he felt to all humanity, with the concept of equalizing man and removing, ultimately, the stigma and stain of intergenerational trauma that came with slavery. Now, one of the things I'll have to point out, of course, is that very similar to the North's argument, the concept of human rights is very new. It's very post-Enlightenment. It's very modern. And it mostly sources, at least in advocacy, if not in mind, from Eleanor Roosevelt, who gave us mostly the concept, as we understand it today, of inalienable human rights on part of the War Organization of the United Nations having something to work with once peace was deemed to have been reached or enforced upon the world. And therefore, we come to the concept of inalienable human rights as promoted by the United Nations as something new on the scene. It is very weak in terms of having a history behind it of what we base our laws on in the West, which is mostly biblical sourcing. So this is why, as a theologian, realizing this, Martin Luther King Jr. had to look for more solid, immediate results, something that would be enforced or could be enforced, and that would have to manifest in civic rights. So the civic rights are the rights of the state. The state can remove them, as pointed out by this wonderful individual. I believe the name is World Walker or something. I'll get to his quote again when I come back to Martin Luther King Jr. because of his weekend passing so soon and what we've said of him already and the thoughts that he provokes in me in light of everything we're dealing with today, tonight, right now. What we have is a situation where pragmatically, in the terms of realpolitik, it all comes down to who has the ability to enforce the philosophy. He who has the guns makes the rules. He who holds the whip makes the rules. And unfortunately, because of that reality, loath as it be to liberal ears, the communist dictator Mao Zedong was utterly correct, tragically so, when he said political power comes from the barrel of a gun. So for that reason, many in America are obscenely fetishistic about firearms because they want to have all the power themselves. They collect all the guns. They'll claim it's to protect you from government tyranny. It's all bullshit. They want to kill you and take all power for themselves by destroying the very government because they hate it. They're openly in rebellion. If they say they're protecting themselves from government tyranny, they are rebels who are antithetical to the federal government. They are criminals. They are terrorists. And since they want to kill you to destroy the very government which protects you from mass murderers like them, your only defense is to kill them first. That's the reality. This is war. So when we go back to the ethno-religious conflict that leads to this kind of madness and our need to contain this madness, to deport this madness, to exile it from our lands for our own safety, much better arguments against American slavery existed from some Protestants and, interestingly, some Catholics as well. And such arguments pointed out that using Israel as an example for American slavery made the mistake of conflating Israel with America, a mistake Americans have been making for generations prior the American Civil War between the states, and a mistake that Americans have been making ever fucking since. To the diabolic American, the idiot and the asinine, Israel is America. If the South, the slave-owning, chattel-based economic slavery run South, if antebellum Dixie could use Israel for support, it would still defeat them. The Protestants and Catholics arguing against its biblical right to maintain other men in bondage. For one, slaves had rights in Israel. They did not in the South. So the South took Israel, stood upon its shoulders, and perverted history of the true Israelites that under Assyrian assault emigrated en masse to the islands of Japan, as outlined in detail during my transmissions on the day of Epiphany of the Gregorian calendar. Just look through my recent transmissions after Christmas. You have a Dixie argument based on biblical rationalization that takes a higher civilization and degrades it with the need or the exploitive rationale of industrial mass exploitation processes where a slave is not an individual in bondsmanship, but property as one who is dead, an ambulatory tool, as much a piece of furniture on wheels as a tractor. For another reason that this Southern argument be self-defeating on part of the rationalization of economic slavery. Mosaic law prescribed years of jubilee every 7th year and again at the 50th year, in which all slaves were freed and all debt canceled. The South never practiced this. And again, slavery in Israel was not racial, perpetual, or hereditary. The South condemned themselves by asking to be judged by the law of the most holy book of the Bible. So as a Christian myself, in analysis of the Southern rationalization of chattel slavery, in affiliation with Israel, this is part of the American psychosis that has spread from the South, based on baptism, that all America is a satrap, a slave, and a pale reflection of motherfucking Israel. And the false Israel of today, of the Hazar, thereby drags via a fishing line with a hook in the mouth as a minnow the whale of the United States as empire in its wake throughout the Mediterranean, in slave circuitry to the foreign policy of Antichrist, as manifest in Donald Trump moving the capital of Israel in recognition by the United States from Tel Aviv-Yafo, the financial capital of Israel, to Yerushalayim, Jerusalem, the holy city. Donald Trump is the best president the Israelis ever had. And under him, by vacating all American personnel from Syria, he paves the way for Antichrist in the body and person of Vladimir Putin, eager to assume that role and enthusiastic to rule the world from Jerusalem as his capital, to marching into Israel to be welcomed with open arms by Bibi Netanyahu, the same motherfucking piece of shit who sponsors neo-Nazis, who are in practice anti-Nazis, and white supremacist movements throughout Eastern Europe and Western Europe and North America, so that all together, the Israelis, the Americans, and the motherfucking Russians, along with their sour satellite, the suck-ass Brits, can bring about the world order of Antichrist in your lifetime. The Brits, the Yanks, the Ruskies, and the Kikes of Israel all deserve each other. You don't need to be a part of that. That's all based on this ideology out of the South, defeated by its own Israel warship, taken and has distorted into their exploitation of another human being, which they believe to be a subhuman species, as warped as your Dixie of today, which is the bastion of republicanism in these United States. This is why the South must not be allowed to secede. It must be forced to secede. We don't want the South in the United States, because certain biblical principles of justice, mercy, and love certainly applied to arguments against slavery, but these more careful Protestant and Catholic voices applied them differently at the time of our first Civil War than most abolitionists. For starters, they kept such principles clear of democratic ideology, on which Scripture remains silent, at least directly, and pro-slavery arguments have always pointed this out. The goal for the Christian, according to these arguments, was not so much to live in light of specific texts, but in light of the flow of history itself. If God's kingdom is not coming, but is already here in Christ, we have to live in the light of the now reality of God's kingdom. In God's kingdom, we will not enslave one another. Evidence exists. This is not just in scripture, but in the early history of the church. Christians worked to liberate slaves, and medieval civilization stood as the first major civilization in history to essentially eliminate slavery. It got reintroduced only in the Renaissance, when pagan Roman concepts of property and ownership tragically got transported back into Europe's bloodstream. The Roman example of slavery also condemns Southerners, at least to extent. For one, Roman slavery lacked the racial character of Southern slavery. In one of the best chapters in the book, The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, the author Noaught pulls from sources that show that the real problem for the American South was not slavery, but race. So whatever one might say about slavery in a general vacuum, no good arguments existed for slavery as practiced by the antebellum South. Unfortunately, such arguments never made it into the mainstream of American cultural life, because every observation I provide you as an Asian Christian, as a Christian from the oldest of all Christians, the oldest of all lines of Christians, through my late and sainted Cyrus, Diana Suchin Lin Dietrich, tracing its lineage through the original SS, the sons of Seth, all the way back to the righteous third son of Adam. Only someone with my background can even explain Christianity to you in such a way that the white savages of North America had no intellectual capacity to even begin to comprehend. Because as white savages, they could only have the barest inkling or understanding of a Christianity from which they had whitewashed the Chinese kings of Asia, who had come by a dozen to baptize and coronate your God as King of Kings. Because they took the number down from 12 to 3 in your King James Bible, on which you rest your very soul. Because they whitewashed out the Asian race of these kings of Asia. Because they took the most vital part of your Christian history, the fact that it existed before Christ, out of your religion. All you white savages could do was exist in a vacuum of morality, in a vacuum of reality, in an anti-narrative absent of history, to argue in the most vacuous sense over details, textual differences. And yet you laughed along with Gibbon, the intellectual idiot, over the original Christian fathers of the East killing each other over an iota changing the definition of a word. Without which, if my Orthodox Church had not won out against the Arian heresy, you would know Christ today only as a figure of childish fun and Hercules, who went around and loved, but never once in the Bible laughed, that part being taken out of the revelation of the Magi, in which as a child he did so laugh. Already dehumanized, he would be a caricature, a Superman who never smiled, nailed to a tree, and ultimately you would still be in paganism today, had that one iota on the part of the Arian heresy won out, and my Church of the East lost out. As to why the reality of this never made it into the mainstream of American cultural life, from the very logic that I've argued concerning the realities of both Roman and true Israeli slavery, not talking about the Israelites of today, but the Israelites of the founding fathers of the Yamato dynasty of Japan. You might assume something along the lines of a short attention span, but that would fit modern times more readily. The Americans of the Civil War era had no such excuse. In fact, audiences flocked to hear discourses and debates of all kinds in the mid-19th century. Lincoln and Douglas, an African American, a black, in 1858, spoke for many hours at a time to packed audiences. One debate on slavery lasted for multiple hours over multiple days to an audience of several hundred. Americans had nothing but time on their hands. Rather, the reason lies in the common root shared by mainstream arguments about slavery on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line, that scar of shame across the United States. The mainstream arguments for and against slavery before the Civil War had the following characteristics I observed. They involve no more than a 1 to 2 step reasoning process. They insist on the plain character of truth. Neither side can be described as anti-intellectual, but arguers for both sides seem to show an exasperation with the need to develop arguments at all. The truth was always so obvious unto they. Anti-slavery arguments relied on simple principle. Pro-slavery arguments on isolated small texts. Both arguments only functioned along one track, one line of thought. Whichever side won the argument, it asked the motherfucking war. The future for having the church influence culture looked bleak. The Enlightenment had done its dirty work. Subconsciously, perhaps, we reject oversimplifications because reality and our experience have more complexity and mystery than the Enlightenment can fathom. Rejecting this truth condemned us to search aimlessly for generations since, hence to fill the void with politics, the American dream, sex, and the like. Not in the sense that I, or Jesus Christ whom I emulate, employ sex, which is a realization of our embodiment, a union with an opposite that makes us one, without the need for some contract between us, like a marriage certificate. Rather, what you have in the West is something based entirely on litigation. And, of course, the sex here has been downgraded. Not into the sense where a man like me can be obvious and open about being a pornoholic and a sexaholic, but rather, to the lot of you in the culture of the West, the sex is simply another aspect of emptiness. Another way to pass time. It's not an art. It's not even a hobby. All of this is due to your lack of religiosity, which actually makes sexuality so much richer. Obviously, Western theologians could and did make nuanced and complex arguments, but Western culture as a whole failed to notice or heed them. As a buttress to his observations about slavery arguments, Noaught, in the work entitled The Civil War as a Theological Crisis, he included a section on the idea of God's providence as debated before and after the war. True to form, both sides found obvious answers to the results of the conflict. For the Southerners, even their defeat showed the rightness of their cause. For God disciplines those he loves. I.e., we are experiencing discipline, showing God's love for us, showing the rightness of our cause. For it is often true that the godly rarely prosper in this world. For the North, their arguments had a simpler character, though no doubt the South would have made them had they won the war. We won. God was and is on our side. Therefore, we were our right. Now, even Abraham Lincoln, a psychotic madman, who today would be diagnosed, not judged or opined, as in simply an opinion. He would have been medically and clinically diagnosed as his very character profile fills chapters in medical textbooks of psychiatry as a manic depressant. Even a manic depressant psychotic like Abraham Lincoln understood better than that and pushed back on this simple approach of we won, we be right. We may always know that God has events in his hand, he agreed, but the particular application of his providence oft remains a mystery to us. but not even someone of Lincoln's stature could get others to embrace this more nuanced perspective. So Noaugh's work in this day and age has great value for his illumination of the state of religion in 19th century America. What makes it even more intriguing is how he reveals what may be the central problem of American political and educational life. Our problem really resides not in short attention spans, not in one political party or the other, not the sexual revolution or other such movement. Rather, Americans need to grapple with how our democratic ideology meshes with the nature of truth itself. This is why the assault on fact by the Russian propaganda machine is the assault of the anti-gods on the essence of the fabric of reality itself. The sundering of the fabric of reality allows for the anti-gods to enter our world with ever and ever greater ease and service only Michael Aquino and his affiliates. Now, Noaught included some interesting statistics showing the decline of religion and growth of government as being directly related to each other. This should not surprise us, as Calhoun foretold. And he's not someone I'd like to agree with very often. You had an absolute need for more government because there was less and less church in the lives of people to enforce any sense of civility or community or charity. Therefore, the government had to fill that vacuum. In 1860, about 4.7 million people voted in the presidential election. But in that same year, between 3 to 4 times that many regularly attended church on Sundays. In 2004, which was a year cited around the time this book was published, about 115 million went to the polls, which equaled the number of regular church attendees in 1860. Now, Noaught, I don't know if he took this into account. He should have if he didn't. Of course, this would be impacted by the fact that women and many minorities did not vote in 1860. Neither women nor minorities had the right to vote. Now, in 1860, the number of Methodist clergy equaled the number of postal workers. Today, the ratio of postal workers to Methodist clergy approximates 9 to 1. Before mass mobilization in 1860, the number of active duty military was about half the number of clergy in the country. In the early 21st century, before mobilization for the war in Iraq, the ratio of military to clergy was 3 to 1. In 1860, the total outcome of the churches and religious organizations nearly equaled the federal budget. That's their income, rather. All their income put together of the churches and religious organizations was equal to that of the federal budget prior to the Civil War. Today, the ratio of federal income to annual religion-related giving is about 25 to 1. In 1860, about 400 institutions of higher learning existed, with nearly all of them run by religious groups. In 1860, there were 35 churches for each bank. Today, there are 4 churches for each bank. Now, in an interesting digression, the author of the work entitled The Civil War's Theological Crisis, Mr. Noaught, points out that warfare and dramatic social change have oft produced great works of lasting theological depth. Now, I myself am reminded immediately of Augustine's The City of God, but numerous other examples exist. St. Bernard during the Crusades, and St. Francis experienced a dramatic shift after fighting in a small war. In the modern era, Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, his first name Dietrich, not his surname, comes most clearly to mind. He's controversial as well. The Germans made him a hero because he was anti-Nazi. But by this model of great thinkers coming out of war and writing their thoughts in a manner that impacts their societies, the American Civil War between the states should have, but completely failed to produce any significant theological insight. I'm sorry, Mark Twain just doesn't cut it. And this reveals a thin theology throughout North and South at that time that allowed this war to take place in the first place. There was no real godliness. The people of North America were simply taking a text already censored by King James and using it to justify and rationalize their desire, their agenda of total genocide of the Celtic fringe on the northern side, and their desire to enslave another race of humanity on the southern side. So in that light, a vacuous, power-mongering, human blackness, human shittiness, perhaps not surprisingly, the great storytellers of the 20th century, MacDonald, Lewis, Tolkien, Flannery O'Connor, Walker Piercy, all came from liturgical and historical traditions. The lone men of faith in a wilderness of exploitationists. And that's where we're at today. A true wilderness among the rising nuns that exemplify for us the ultimate atrophy of bicamerality in the vestigial mind. I've oft, as someone who's relied on communications to keep me alive in terms of technology, while involved in mercenary and security enforcement contracts, employed the analogy of the mic to the godly and the godless, or rather, the fanatics of religion, and those who decry religion with disbelief or atheism. When people can't hear God, have no feeling for God, when they are essentially saying that God is an illusion. And as a matter of fact, the man behind much of that in the postmodern era is a Richard Dawson. And the Richard Dawson is the man who I believe, that might be his name, the God part of the brain, because now when I'm looking him up, I'm getting an actor, a comedian, God delusion, Richard Dawkins. So his surname is spelled Dawkins, and he wrote a book entitled The God Delusion. He's an English biologist, a professorial fellow at New College, Oxford, a former holder of the Charles Simonyi Chair for the Public Understanding of Science at the University of Oxford. He originally published his book in 2006. And he's interviewed in BBC on such television interview specials as Beautiful Minds, if you can believe that. And Richard Dawkins might be someone who, similar to another man who wrote The God Part of the Brain, who claims, I think, he plagiarized his work when he wrote The God Delusion. And he had the winning position simply because he was an established professorial type. Whether or not these atheists battling it out with each other originated their concept, it's only I myself who ever provided the analogy that has any practical value. So when people ask me about religious fanatics who believe that they're speaking directly with God, that they're doing God's will, either via terrorism, mass murder, some other atrocities that they're participating in or perpetrating. The problem with religious fanatics that are always held up as the darlings of the atheists, that they love to hate, that they love to use as an example of why religion is poison to the mind. The problem with these fanatics be simply that they're stepping on the mic. In other words, they're talking so much, they can't hear God at all. And they're doing all the talking. Whenever they talk to God, It's only their own voice that they hear. This is what happens when you get on the microphone and other people are trying to communicate and they can't because you're dominating the radio waves. It's called stepping on the mic. And in terms of the atheists, their microphone's simply not functioning. I've spoken of the bicameral mind. When the bicameral mind atrophies so much that you can no longer hear the voice of God, even in the metaphor, then at that point, you have the laziness of the disbeliever. They are vestigial in their mental capacity as someone who has lost their limbs. They are essentially disabled. So there's an evolutionary reason for that. And if they're functioning on a moral level, whereas atheists, they still serve a humanist code, an ethic, an agenda, like Gene Roddenberry, via his humanist philosophy as manifest through the entire Star Trek franchise, which still carries on his philosophy religiously, to use a pun, of humanism, then that's fine. There's an evolutionary purpose for why God allows such minds to atrophy. And that brings us to the world's newest major religion. No religion at all. The rising nun movement, where they register themselves on surveys as none. As secularism grows, atheists and agnostics are trying to expand and diversify their ranks as aggressively as churches have done in the past. More people than ever before are identifying as atheist, agnostic, or otherwise non-religious, with potentially world-changing effects. You don't usually think of churches as going out of business, but it happens. In March of 2016, for example, driven by parishioner deaths and lack of interest, the United Kingdom Mennonites held their last collective service. It might seem easy to predict that plain-dressing Anabaptists, who follow a faith related to the Amish, would become irrelevant in the age of smartphones, but this be part of a larger trend. Around the world, when asked about their feelings on religion, more and more people are responding with a meh. The religiously unaffiliated nuns, as they call themselves, N-O-N-E-S, as in the nullity, which I always forewarn of when it comes to the anti-gods, and nihilism, as in annihilate. The philosophy of nihilism is one of nothing having any consequence. These nuns aren't necessarily part of that. They're part more of an apathy, and they're growing significantly with the apathy of humanity. They're the second largest religious group in North America and most of Europe. In the United States, nuns make up almost a quarter of the population. In the past decade, American nuns have, or United States nuns, I'm not too knowledgeable about the Canadians, they've overtaken Catholics, mainline Protestants, and all followers of non-Christian faiths. A lack of religious affiliation has profound effects on how people think about death, how they teach their kids, and how they vote. Now, you can watch The Story of God with Morgan Freeman. I'm sure that's on YouTube by now, for more about how different religions understand God and creation. And there have long been predictions that religion would fade from relevancy as the world modernizes. But all the recent surveys are finding that it's happening startlingly fast. France will have a majority secular population soon. So will the Netherlands and New Zealand. The United Kingdom and Australia will soon lose Christian majorities. Religion is rapidly becoming less important than it's ever been, even to people who live in countries where faith has affected everything from rulers to borders and architecture. But nuns aren't inheriting the earth just yet. I know for a fact in many parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa in particular, religion is growing so fast that nuns' share of the global population will actually shrink in 25 years as the world turns into what one researcher has described as the secularizing West and the rapidly growing rest. Now, the other highly secular part of the world is only nominally Communist China, only in name. The Cultural Revolution tamped down religion for decades. But in Communist China, as in all other former communist countries, religion is on the increase. And even in the secularizing West, the rash of religious freedom bills, which essentially decriminalize discrimination, are the latest front in a faith-tinged culture war in the United States that shows no signs of abating anytime soon. Only now it's all in the name of Satanism. Every time you see freedom of religion, freedom of speech being exploited, it's by two separate sewers of shit, both united actually into one slimy sea of, I can't come up with a word worse than shit, so it's got to be that. And that is, of course, the radioactive toxic waste of anti-godliness that combines white supremacy and out-and-out Satanism. Open, honest Satanism. That at this day and age is no longer Satanism, but perverted into the anti-godliness, the cult of Cthulhu, the Temple of Set, the Aquino movements. This is why everywhere you go, you see examples of Satanism. Those aren't produced by practicing Satanists like the Church of Satan, as founded by Anton Szandor LaVey. These are produced by freedom of speech freaks who want to make it so that child pornography will be legal, so that white supremacy will be legal, and that all white supremacists can fuck their sisters and their mothers and their daughters without fear, because no one else will have sex with those motherfuckers because they're just pure human shit. And nobody likes them, and they smell bad too because they never bathe. So within the ranks of the unaffiliated, divisions run deep. You've got these out-and-out white supremacist anti-gods out there, the anti-godly cultists. You've got the avowed atheists. Others are agnostic. Many more simply don't care to state a preference. Organized around skepticism toward organizations and united by a common belief that they do not believe. Nuns as a group are just as internally complex as many religions. And as with religions, these internal contradictions could keep new followers away. But in general, the millennials are saying to God, no thanks. If the world's at a religious precipice, we've been moving there towards that cliff's edge for decades. 50 years ago, Time asked in a famous headline, "Is God dead?" The magazine wondered whether religion was relevant to modern life in the post-atomic age, where communism was spreading and science was explaining more about our natural world than ever before. And because of your ignorance of the original Asian Christianity, you're all still asking the same question. But the response isn't limited to yes or no. A chunk of the population born after that Time article was printed may respond to the provocative question with, God who? In Europe and North America, the unaffiliated tend to be several years younger than the population average. Around 11% of Americans born after 1970 were raised in secular homes. Scientific advancement isn't just making people question God, it's also connecting those who question. It's easy to find atheists and agnostic discussion groups online, even if you come from a religious family or community. And anyone who wants the companionship that might otherwise come from a church can attend a secular Sunday assembly or one of a plethora of meetups for humanists, atheists, agnostics, or skeptics. The groups behind the web forums and meetings do more than give skeptics witty rejoinders for religious relatives or who might try and pressure them to go to church. They let budding agnostics know that they're not alone. But it's not easy to unite people around not believing in something. So organizing atheists is like herding cats. So you've got this group that's organizing itself out of existence, trying to normalize atheism to a point where it's so common that atheists no longer need a group to tell them it's okay not to believe, or to defend their morals in the face of religious lawmakers. But we're not there yet. Because atheism's got a diversity problem. And almost all atheist groups are overwhelmingly white. So there is pressure in the African American community that places a hold of Christianity into African American history that leads to a sense of intergenerational identity. In the abolition movement churches, it became a support system for blacks. It became almost the end-all be-all for the black community for a number of years because the civil rights movement was dominated. Some atheists would say hijacked by religious leaders, either Muslim, like Malcolm X, or Christian, like Martin Luther King Jr. So if you either reject or identify as a non-believer, you're seen as betraying your race among certain facets of the black community. So the secularizing West is full of, guess what? White supremacists. White male supremacists. Incels. Involuntary celibates. The same motherfuckers who are promoting Trump while he's promoted on the other side by bigoted evangelicals, which I'll get into in another moment. But the general U.S. population is 46% male and 66% white. So about 68% of atheists are men and 78% are white. So it's part of white privilege to exercise the privilege of non-belief. There's a few theories about why people become atheists in large numbers. Some demographers attribute it to financial security, which would explain why European countries with a stronger social safety net are more secular than the United States, where poverty is far more common because the United States is a third world, while Western Europe is a first world. And the Soviet Union's post-Soviet state of Russia is a fourth or fifth world level of development. It's so far back, it's not even developed anymore. It's like literally an apocalyptic wasteland of white savages literally killing themselves by crawling around on skyscrapers and filming it on iPhones the last moments of their life. I'm not shitting you. This is exactly what they do. You can look at this on YouTube. You can see Russian kids just falling off of just old industrial wasteland scrapes that they climb to the top and they've got nothing else to do in life other than die a spectacular death by falling off of some abandoned nuclear power plant or some shit. That's what life is like in Russia, which is why Americans all worship them, because Americans are motherfucking stupid and feel that that's the shit to live like that. So, you know, the majority of these Americans can move there. We will deport them because they're bringing the rest of us down. But in Europe, of course, where they're secure, there's a lot more lack of a need to believe in God anymore because they're not praying for relief from the Mongols or the Black Plague or the Muslims who've got the gates of Vienna under siege. So here in the United States, where a medical emergency can bankrupt even those that are fully insured, you're praying to God all the fucking time. So you'd have to be pretty fucking rich, pretty fucking male, and pretty fucking white to be an atheist. And that's what atheists are. Atheism's also tied to education. Measured by academic achievement, atheists in many places tend to have college degrees or general knowledge of the panoply of beliefs around the world. Hence, theories that internet access spurs atheism are arising. And there's some evidence that official state religions drive people away from faith entirely, which could help explain why the United States is more religious than most Western nations that technically have a state religion, even if it is rarely observed. The United States is also home to a number of homegrown churches. Mormonism, of course, historically. Scientology, ahistorically. And that might scoop up those who are disenchanted with older faiths. Now, the social factors that promote atheism, financial security and education, have long been harder to attain for women and people of color in the United States. So around the world, the Pew Research Center finds that women tend to be more likely to affiliate with a religion and more likely to pray and find religion important in their lives. That changes when women have more opportunities. Now, Conrad Hackett with the Pew Research Center has stated women who are in the labor force are more like men in religiosity. Women out of the labor force tend to be more religious. Part of that might be because they're part of a religious group that enforces the power of women being at home. In a Washington Post opinion editorial about the racial divides among atheists, Black Skeptics Group's founder Sikivu Hutchinson pointed out that the number of Black and Latino youth with access to quality science and math education is so abysmally low that means they have far fewer economic opportunities and less exposure to a worldview that does not require the presence of God. And religion has a place for women, people of color, and the poor. By its nature, secularism is open to all, but it's not always as welcoming. So some of the humanist movement's most visible figures aren't known for their respect toward women. Prominent atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins have awful reputations for misogyny, as does the late Christopher Hitchens. And Bill Maher, the Jewish comedian and outspoken atheist, is no angel in any way, shape, or form. His primary victim of choice is black woman, whom he dates and constantly berates as basically what he calls monkeys with long hair, ass, and tits. And I'm not exaggerating this man's racism or his misogyny. He is your average Jewish, misogynist, racist piece of shit. A spoiled white kike. So what's sometimes called the New Atheism picked up in the mid-2000s. These were years of war when Islam was painted as a threat and Christianity infused U.S. policy abroad and domestically, most visibly in faith-based ballot initiatives against same-sex marriage. And in the United States, many state legislators are still using a narrow interpretation of Christian morals to deny services to gay people and appropriate restrooms to people who are transgender. And now you've got the president using his PAC Supreme Court to deny recognition of the alternative lifestyles community in the military, when overwhelmingly the community is homosexual in the military. The military mafia is, for all intents and purposes, universally a cult of faggots. So the national backlash to this kind of religious legislation and persecution has become faster and fiercer than ever before. Europeans seem set on addressing Islamophobia and the forces that could create tension with a rapidly growing West. And compared to past campaign seasons, religion actually took a back seat in the year 2016. Donald Trump was not outwardly religious. His attraction of evangelical voters really did raise questions about the longevity and motives of the religious right. Hillary Rodham Clinton was quoted as saying, "Advertising about faith doesn't come naturally to me." Bernie Sanders, of course, was just an old commie, and to say he wasn't actively involved in any religion was to put it mildly. He was America's version of Jeremy Corbyn. All their reticence about religion reflected the second largest religious group in the country that they hope to run. Aside from Ted Cruz, the leading candidates just weren't up for talking about religion. The number of Americans who sought divine intervention in the voting booth, they all were shrinking. And that's how the Russians moved in. It was a lack of a faith in God that led to an opening for the Antichrist empire of Gog to move in and press the levers in cyberspace, electronically, to put the arbiter of Antichrist in the White House. And this is because for all the work secular groups do to promote acceptance of non-believers, nothing be as effective as apathy and time. And it's trying to turn back that clock that brought the white evangelicals like cockroaches out of the walls in their fear of the future and their yearning for the past to make Donald Trump their Messiah. White evangelicals saw in Donald Trump a president who could help them in their fight against diversity, abortion, and the shrinking role of religion. Reactionary evangelicals were celebrating back when Donald Trump was about to name his second conservative Supreme Court justice at the time Anthony Kennedy was retiring. They quoted the Old Testament book of Esther that they had been waiting for a time such as this. Now, as a Christian, a true Christian out of Asia, who follows the Church of the East, the Near East, the closest and oldest relation to our true church going back to the sons of Set in Far East Asia, I myself have wondered why evangelicals in America backed Trump's zero-tolerance immigration plan that separated families at the border. I tried to make sense of why some of them would give him a mulligan, to use the Family Research Council President Tony Perkins' now famous phrase, for Trump's alleged adulterous affair with adult film star Stormy Daniels. Why did so many evangelicals remain silent or offer tepid and qualified responses when Trump equated white supremacists and their opponents in Charlottesville, Virginia, the summer before last? What kind of power does Trump hold over men and women who claim to be followers of Jesus, the Christ? Evangelical support for Trump goes much deeper than simply a few Supreme Court justices. Like most Americans, on November 8th, 2016, I watched election returns, fully expecting that Hillary Rodham Clinton would be declared the nation's first female president, as she was duly elected by popular majority overwhelmingly, winning by a landslide the popular vote. When this didn't happen, due to motherfucking Russian electronic hacking, I was saddened and angry, but my emotions were less about the new president-elect and more about the way so-called Christian evangelicals were using their social media feeds to praise God for Donald Trump's victory in the name of Antichrist. My raw emotions gave way to my training as a historian and my study of world religion, even though I did so under the wing of Satan himself. And my distress about Trump's election didn't wane, never does. But I myself should have seen this coming. Trump's win was just the latest manifestation in a long-standing evangelical approach to politics. Because ever since World War II, white evangelicals in the United States have waged a desperate and largely failing war against thickening walls of separation between church and state, the removal of Christianity from public schools, the growing ethnic and religious diversity of the nation, the intrusion of the federal government into their everyday lives, especially as it pertains to desegregation and civil rights, because of religious men like Martin Luther King Jr. on the side of the other as far as they were concerned. That and legalized abortion. In the 1980s, Jerry Falwell Sr. and other reactionary evangelicals concerned about this moral drift as they discerned it, devised a political playbook to win back the culture and restore America to its supposedly Christian origins. All a lie, all a myth. Your founding fathers were Satanists and deists, men who thought that God created the universe as a clockwork mechanism and abandoned it, that men like George Washington and Benjamin Franklin could assume the Godhead themselves and ascend the throne of heaven. So Falwell Sr.'s playbook for Christian politics based on a lie is a playbook that's too often led its followers towards nativism, xenophobia, racism, and intolerance. It's a playbook that divides rather than unites. The social and cultural changes of the Obama administration, particularly regarding human sexuality, sent reactionary evangelicals into a state of blind panic. They saw Donald Trump as the Republican candidate best suited to protect them from the forces working to undermine the values of the world they once knew, where the white man stood supreme atop the world. But these anxieties extend even deeper into the American past. They're a logical result of 300 years, from the Puritans to the American Revolution, and from nativism to fundamentalism, of evangelical fears about the direction in which their so-called Christian nation was moving. Politics of fear inevitably results in a quest for power. Clergymen and religious leaders have, at least since Billy Graham, regularly visited the White House to advise the president. Like members of the King's Court during the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, who sought influence and worldly approval by flattering the monarch, rather than prophetically speaking truth to power. Trump's court evangelicals boast about their unprecedented